A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I lied about being colorblind to everybody I know, and now I'm terrified that the truth is about to come back and destroy me. It all started 2 years ago when I found myself at an art museum on a first date, staring at an abstract piece that swirled in a riot of colors I couldn't describe. My date was raving about the artist's use of cerulean blue, crimson red, and sunlit yellow, but I was stuck trying to match my own reality to what everyone else saw, so I blurted out that I was colorblind, hoping it would explain my uninspired silence. The lie spiraled into my life like a spilled drop of paint across a pristine canvas. I found solace in the assumption that I was perceived as an innocent oddity, a quiet soul ensnared in shades of gray, when in reality I was flourishing in the richness of color. I threw myself into the deception, regaling my friends with stories of how I navigated life through hues that didn't exist for me, while secretly wielding my phone's color-picking apps to inform my wardrobe choices and social media posts. I reveled in their sympathy. My friends began to treat me like a creative genius hindered by a chemical deficiency, while I became the imposter in the gallery of my own personality. Yet, fear bubbled just beneath the surface, especially after one fateful encounter with a painter at a local art fair. They handed me a palette straight from their collection and asked how I felt about the interplay of colors. I stood there, drenched in sweat, blood pumping frantically, panic gnawing at my insides as I lied again, basing my description on perceived trends rather than reality. Somehow, they didn't see through my facade, but my heart remained lodged in my throat, with every lie propelling me further from the person I was meant to be. Months turned into a year, and my life unfurled under the weight of deception. It made me sick, but I couldn't stop lying. It fed on my insecurities, trapping me in a distorted reality where truth felt like a bomb waiting to go off. And then, one day, everything came crashing down. An old acquaintance from high school reached out to me, a muralist who recognized me from my pretense of art appreciation. Eager to reconnect and showcase their latest work, they invited me to an exhibition opening. I should have declined, but curiosity gnawed at my insides. I stepped into the vibrant room, the air thick with laughter and anticipation, when I caught a glimpse of the mural. The stellar overwhelming colors that should have made me feel alive left an icy chill racing down my spine. The artist had painted a massive piece depicting a scene from our childhood, a memory I'd long buried. Every vivid shade triggered emotions long forgotten, and unrestrained waves of shame surged through my veins. My friends cheered, and I stood frozen, suddenly aware of how absurd it was that the true me was liquefied behind artifice. In the murmur of voices, I heard someone mention how extraordinary it was for a colorblind person to appreciate art. That statement was like a slap across my face. I felt sweat bead on my forehead, and bile crawled up my throat as I realized the web of lies I spun had ensnared not just me, but everyone who cared. My vision began to dim, and an instinctive impulse jolted me to escape. I rushed outside, feeling shadows closing in as I stumbled down the sidewalk, desperate to shut out the noise, when I heard my muralist acquaintance yelling after me, trying to piece together my strange behavior. Instead of stopping, I ducked around a corner, and my heart pounded like a war drum while I crouched behind a dumpster, taking deep breaths, the world around me blurring into muted waters. I prayed that my ruse would hold. But dread clung to me as I caught sight of a flicker from my periphery. A woman in the crowd had noticed my sudden retreat. She approached the mural, confusion etched across her face, and then she stepped back in horror. "That's not real," she gasped. "I don't believe this." The words buried into the ground beneath me like daggers, and I caught her desperate glance scouring for someone, anyone who would believe her. I couldn't bear it. I had to run, but a sense of slipping sanity gripped me in a vice. The lie I told to protect myself was splintering all around, with the chatter of muted disbelief echoing harshly within my skull. I kept my head down, moving swiftly through the streets until, at last, I plummeted into my apartment like a specter escaping a haunting. I isolated myself for days, drowning in shame, haunted by the fear that someone would expose me, the colorblind fake loved and revered by my friends, the surface version of myself endlessly praised but never the real me. My anxiety screamed for release until finally I returned to the mural, rationalizing that perhaps honesty could save me. I stepped inside, trembling, searching for the muralist, but the room was swallowed in silence as a crowd stood in awe of the piece that reeked of my lies, every stroke of paint echoing my deceit. I cleared my throat, preparing to confess, but that was when I noticed it. A shadow eased across the mural, stretching eerily in the multi-hued light. Everyone gasped, but my mind suddenly spun. That's when I realized the colors were shifting. The whole mural was oscillating through a spectrum unfamiliar to my eyes but painted by a hand I once knew. What the hell? I murmured, caught in a trance as the hues morphed and wove together like living strands of darkness whispering my name. I stumbled forward, the eyes of the crowd pinning me as I reached out to touch the changing surface, and at that moment a freezing sensation engulfed my skin. The colors danced and wove, intertwining with my very memories. The colors faded, one by one, until everything was enshrouded in black. "You lied," echoed a voice from beyond the surface, familiar yet menacing. My stomach twisted as flames of realizations ignited all around me. I could feel everything I feared swirling like a tempest as the truth behind my colors, my very existence, began to unravel.
Last month, a storm bore down on our small town, thick clouds roiling in a way that felt almost foreboding. It felt like that storm had crept right into my neighbor Lisa's home, too, when she staggered over to my porch, eyes wide and disheveled, clutching her phone like it was a hot coal. "I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and fear, but it wasn't the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the way she said it, as though she was trying so hard to keep it together but knowing her grip on reality was slipping. I could see her young son, Thomas, peeking from behind the screen door, those big, innocent eyes wide with confusion, and suddenly that shiver transforming into a full-blown shudder as I imagined how scared he must be at that moment. What had started as a simple rainstorm turned into an unbearable weight swirling in my stomach. I hadn't had the best relationship with Lisa, she rarely reached out unless she needed something, and here she was, practically demanding I take care of Thomas just so she could feel free enough to leave. The storm rumbled ominously overhead, and I didn't want to find myself plunged into the chaos of her life, so I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before saying, but frankly, I couldn't even finish that one pathetic little word before she started begging, "Please, I've tried calling a babysitter, but they're all busy. I can't leave him. Not now." I could see that desperation and fear were mixing into a cocktail of urgency, and my insides twisted as I imagined the looming hospital visit, thoughts racing through my mind about what it might reveal. What if something terrible was going on? What if I said yes and it spiraled downward? I shook my head, feeling my resolve harden despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. I told her, "I'm really sorry, Lisa, but I can't. I have plans." It wasn't a lie, my nerves had been frayed by last week's sleepless nights and the dreadful anxiety that came with the unknown. There was something inside me that whispered she'd find someone else, and while I pressed my lips together to silence it, it only amplified in the silence. Her face fell, anger momentarily flashing in those wild eyes before they pooled with tears, and just then as the wind picked up, a small rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, resonating the storm's resonance with her heartbreak. "You're a monster," she hissed, and although I sucked in a breath, ready to explain how I wasn't prepared for her chaos, the moment just shattered. "All I'm asking is for a few hours," she continued, her voice trembling. "What would you do in my place?" I realized this was no longer about me or my panic. I had to find what was beneath my refusal, what was the cost now that I had said it out loud. I could feel guilt creeping into the corners of my heart, coupling with my relentless anxiety. I had just locked myself out of something elemental. She twisted away from me, storm clouds roiling in her eyes as she retreated, that small hand of her son reaching for her, this sweet boy who didn't understand anything beyond a child's innocence. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I would pay for my refusal. And just as I started to make amends with myself, an ominous message flashed on my phone very late one night. A simple text read, "Lisa was found." I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, burying me in doubt. The words "found" could mean anything, yet they stood stark against the solitude of night, intensifying my fear. I didn't even know how to process that, who to reach out to, or what else I might have caused when I had chosen my own comfort over that child in desperate need, the seed of anxiety sprouting into a relentless vine strangling my thoughts. I lost sleep, switched off my phone, and tried to quiet my mind as new pangs of remorse twisted inside. Until finally, the storm decision echoed back, shattering my solitude as I found the resolve to confront my cowardice. I trudged over to her house, the sky heavy with moisture, wind whipping at my clothes. I brought with me just a small bouquet I had cobbled together from my backyard. Upon reaching her home, though, dread built up the moment I caught sight of flashing lights against the windows, the police, their rigid figures silhouetted against the open door, spilling tragedy. A knot in my stomach deepened. I had worse fears about what had happened than I could admit. I stood rooted as I overheard snippets of a conversation. She was in some kind of state. "We'll get him out to safety," and in a shadowed corner of my mind, something thudded sickeningly as the implications crashed over me. I had known. I had known when I felt that chill in my gut, the heaviness of something grotesque awakening after I refused. Then, a small, familiar silhouette collided with my view. Thomas, hair tousled, eyes blurred with tears as he was led away, crying for his mother while the officers inspected his sad little figure. I could see the raw confusion wrapped around his expression like a shroud. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, my heart hammering in my chest as it dawned on me. She hadn't gone to the hospital because she needed to, she had been in an irreversible descent that I had just turned my back on, and that refusal now manifested a darkness I never anticipated, a helpless child standing dumbstruck in a storm of his own, and I froze under all the weight of it. The cries of a frightened boy saturated the evening air, buried deeper into a grisly storm of fate that had been intertwined with my choice, suffocating all rationality. A figure emerged, covering Thomas with a blanket, but all I could see were the words echoing back, reverberating inside me relentlessly, "AITA for refusing to look after a child." And in that haunting moment, as I stood paralyzed among the onlookers, I knew the answer clawing at my insides like an uncontained beast, leaving me ash-gray with dread as I began to understand. It was a fight I had already lost.
It started innocently enough, the kind of exhaustion that wraps around your bones like a heavy blanket when you have a newborn. But by the time my daughter turned 3 months old, I found myself battling something far more sinister than sleep deprivation. It was the night I first heard the whisper, soft and slippery like a serpent slithering through my mind. I was alone in the nursery, rocking Sophie gently in my arms, her tiny body nestled against my chest when I heard it, barely above a whisper, "Shh, let me out." At first, I thought it must have been the moonlight playing tricks on me, a figment conjured by fatigue. But as the song on the baby monitor stuttered and switched to static, it repeated, "Let me out." Panic clotted my chest, urging me to escape the nursery, but I couldn't leave my baby, not for anything. I forced a laugh, telling myself it was just the creaking of the old wooden beams. I made new excuses each night, the wind, the old neighbor's haunted house, anything to convince myself I wasn't unraveling. It persisted, creeping in at unexpected moments. I later realized I could hear it even when I wasn't in the nursery. Room after room, all while Sophie slept peacefully in her crib, as if oblivious to the dark presence spiraling round us. It became almost routine. I'd be washing dishes or folding laundry, the whisper would emerge, slithering through my thoughts, a ghost of sound coaxing me, "You have to do it." One evening, lulled by exhausted delirium, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, my voice trembling as I repeated the words out loud, "Let me out. Let me out." It was then that I caught sight of Sophie's reflection behind me, her innocent blue eyes wide and unblinking, gazing at me like I'd lost my mind. That night marked a turning point. Out of desperation to escape the eerie voice, I began yelling at Sophie, "Close your mouth. Don't lose it." So clueless to what I was doing. My frantic words seeped into the nursery's quiet as the whisper warped around them, draping the space in shadows, thick like fog. I remembered feeling guilty, but every time I opened my mouth, it was as if the darker side of me took control, and it didn't even want to stop at the yelling, it needed to dominate. "What do you want?" I shouted into the nursery one night, the air thick with tension as Sophie's gaze shifted toward the dark corner where the light barely reached. The whisper laughed, that soft, gravelly sound curling through the silence of the room, "You know what I want, dear. You just need to give in." I brushed off my fears by telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks. A stress-induced figment born from midnight feedings and a growing sense of helplessness I felt as a new parent. I sat down at Sophie's crib, looking at her sleeping face, and as if she sensed my panic, she stirred, a little whimper escaping her tiny mouth. I shushed her, and for a moment, everything felt okay again. That was until I was jolted from the reverie by the sound of my own voice murmuring, "You can keep it. Just don't let it go." The chilling realization coursed through me. I was saying things I couldn't remember even thinking. The next day, a desperate attempt to regain control led me to the local bookstore, where I buried my head in parenting books, seeking answers to the madness clawing away at my mind. I would hear parents talk about the stresses of newborn life, but as I desperately scanned the titles, my ears strained for the voice to cease. When I finally got home, I locked the bedroom door, hoping to drown it out with the blissful sounds of Sophie gurgling. But it wasn't enough. The darkness bled into every thought, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting, something that wanted to take Sophie from me. As weeks passed, I devised a new plan. No more letting her cry, no more leaving her alone in the room. I would constantly be vigilant like a guard. But the nights grew longer, and I felt tension creeping in around the edges of our lives like a slow poison, simmering until it erupted into anger and helplessness. I couldn't look my husband in the eye anymore. He could see the panic clawing at me and tried to reach out. I pulled away. "You don't understand," I screamed one night, tears streaming down my face. "You haven't heard it." My voice grew louder, spitting shards of my fear into the walls, but he only stepped back, bewildered, confused. I couldn't articulate it to him. Sometimes I thought Sophie felt the presence too, as I watched her stare into the dark corners of the room, her mouth opening like she was trying to speak with whatever lurked there. It felt like I was tumbling into madness, a dark tunnel with no end in sight. One night, I finally cracked under the pressure. I stood over her crib, screaming into the void, "Do not let it out. Close your mouth, Sophie." My heart raced as her sleepy eyes blinked up at me, the fragile innocence of her gaze slicing through the thick haze of despair. I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a moment where she understood, but then the whisper swelled, wrapping around us both, "She's mine, you know." In that moment, nothing else mattered. I swept Sophie from her crib, cradling her against my chest, desperate to shield her from the dark force that haunted me. I yelled at shadows, I yelled at the whispers, my voice rising in terror as I paced the dark house. That night, as I yelled and begged for it to leave us alone, the air grew cold, and the seals on my sanity began to crack. The last thing I remember is cradling Sophie close, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't just me suffering, it was her too. The corners of my vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping away when that horrible whisper echoed in my head once more, "You've done well. Just a little more, and she will be mine." I released a desperate howl, my heart pounding, and then, silence. The next morning, I found myself in the living room, mysterious scratches running down my arms, and Sophie curled peacefully in her crib as if nothing had ever happened, her mouth shut tight. I looked into her eyes and felt something shift. It was gone. I don't know how long it had been, but perhaps, just perhaps, the battle wasn't over. And even now, each creak of the house at night makes my heart race. I can still hear the whisper sometimes, lurking around the corners of my mind, and I can't help but think the day will come when I'll have to face the darkness fully. All I can do is keep my daughter close and keep screaming the same words day in and day out, "Close your mouth. Don't let it out." I have a secret, and it's not the kind of secret you can shake off easily. It's more like a shadow constantly stalking me, growing longer during the day until it envelopes everything in its path. It started innocently enough when I was a teenager, an idle fascination that morphed into an unsettling obsession. I couldn't help it, it was like my eyes had developed a mind of their own, drawn to the bulges of men regardless of whether I was in a grocery store, a crowded subway, or even at work. At first, I thought maybe it was just my hormones, the rites of teenage passage whispering cruel secrets about what it meant to be attracted to someone. But then it spiraled. I'd see a hint of something in tight jeans, the outline of a body that sent shivers down my spine, and before I knew it, I was caught in a web of inappropriate stares and lingering glances, entwined deep in the thrill of it all. I tried to control myself, eye contact, conversation, whatever I could to overload my senses before succumbing to the urge to look. It was easy to brush it off as harmless curiosity until the day I met Caleb. He moved in next door, a charismatic smile that lit up the entire street and those sweatpants that fit like a second skin. My gaze kept flitting to him, my heart racing with some primal instinct as I watched him weave through his garden, muscles rippling, self-assured. One afternoon, I caught him lifting weights in his backyard, the sunlight glistening on his skin, and my breath hitched. I remembered scolding myself silently, trying to focus on the flowers I was supposed to be tending but failing gloriously. That was the first time I heard the whispering, almost like it was creeping out from my subconscious. "Just look one more time," it taunted, a voice that didn't belong to me yet resonated deep within. Eager to please, my gaze was drawn like a moth to a flame, but I felt a wave of resistance wash over me. I took a few steps back, wanting to run away from this overwhelming tide of embarrassment and desire. But I couldn't. My hands were trembling as I tried to cover my reckless thoughts, and as I turned to bolt, a sudden chill washed over me. Caleb had caught me staring. The look in his eyes told me that he knew. Mortified, I fled back inside, shutting the door behind me as if it could block out my shame. Hours turned into days, a cycle of constant hiding from this man I barely knew, and yet my obsession with him intensified, leaving me no choice but to keep checking, even when I was out with friends. It turned into a game of desperation. I'd pretend to be interested in the bar scene, feigning conversations while secretly scanning the crowd for any hint of pleasing anatomy, hearts quickening, breaths catching. I rationalized it, telling myself that nothing bad could come out of this fixation, that it was just a phase. Yet, this was no ordinary obsession. It felt more sinister, like there was a force behind it pushing me, urging me into darkness. Then one night, after too many drinks, I stumbled home, my head spinning with more than just booze. In the dim light of my living room, I caught sight of Caleb through our window. He was bent over in his kitchen, and I froze, blood roaring in my ears. I leaned closer, the world around me fading, and a really horrible urge washed over me to take it further. This compulsion pushed me to check my phone's camera, and I took a picture, my breath caught in my throat as I snapped the image without hesitation, the screen lighting my face under the dark cloak of night. What had I just done? My hands shook as I deleted the photo, panic coursing through me. I knew I had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The next day, I saw Caleb in the hallway, and I felt different, I felt changed. I was bracing myself, expecting anger, judgment, but he just smiled, his eyes boring into mine. That's when I sensed the shift. I couldn't ignore the feeling that he knew something, that he could see through my facade. I could hardly breathe, embarrassment mingled with a strange thrill coursing through me. I made excuses to avoid him, but I could see him watching me, those eyes lingering way too long, the corners of his mouth teasing upward in an unsettling way. It wasn't just my infatuation that heightened, something darker was unfolding, and I was caught in the middle of it. It became a relentless cycle. Despite my efforts to keep my gaze in check, I found myself staring more and more, addicted to the thrill of the chase. If I looked just long enough, if I lingered just until he caught me, maybe I would finally feel free. But even as I reveled in the rush, I could feel something sinister under the surface. My dreams became haunted by images of him, twisted fantasies that left me terrified to sleep. It felt too real, a manifestation of my longing that transformed the mundane into the vile. I fled into the arms of distraction, binge-watching, late-night runs, but it only grew worse. My friends noticed, concerned whispers chased me as I bogged myself down with work, yet they never understood the dark thrill of sensation I chased. Then came the day when I found a small, folded note slipped under my door. It was simple, a piece of paper stained with black ink, "I see you." My heart dropped, dread crept into my mind, and for the third time that week, I was caught staring out the window watching Caleb. He sat there with his back to me, a casual posture, but something about the stillness felt wrong. I knew I had to confront this madness, to reach some clarity beyond this depravity, so I knocked on his door. When he opened it, there were no judgments in his gaze, but something even worse, a predatory glint that coiled around my gut like a serpent. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just playing an innocent game anymore. I had sparked something dark in him, reflected my own obsessions. He leaned in closer, breath hot against my ear. I could hardly hear the words, a whisper more like a slither. "Coated in poison honey. Why don't you come in? We can make this easier." Terror seized my heart as it dawned on me I had become the object of someone else's fixation, and in that moment, I realized, it wasn't just the bulges that had ensnared me. It was the madness I had beckoned, a sinister twist of fate that bound us together. I turned and fled, feeling his laughter echo behind me, taunting and chilling, and I knew I could never outrun the shadows of my own design. They're right when they say to keep children away from screens. I never understood that warning until 2 months ago when my son, Leo, brought home an old tablet he found in the attic and insisted on using it despite my protests. It was a relic, dirtied and scratched, showing signs of age, and when I pressed the power button, the vivid colors and strange iconography lit up his wide eyes, a bright contrast to the dim light of our living room. At first, I thought it was harmless, just an old gaming device, but it quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. Leo became obsessed. The moment he woke up, he'd be glued to the screen, tapping away at the cracked glass, laughing and talking to characters that seemed to flicker and whisper just beyond the edge of the pixelated graphics. I tried to intervene, watched as his fascination grew more intense with each passing day, until the screen glowed like a neon heart in a dark room, pulsing rhythmically. I noticed changes in him, sleep-deprived, eyes glazed over, his laughter morphing into fits of chilling giggles that made the hair on my neck stand up. When I forced him to turn the tablet off, he'd throw a tantrum, his face contorted with rage, and I couldn't comprehend why my sweet boy was turning into something I barely recognized. One night, I stood outside his door, listening to him talk in low, hurried whispers with something, on the other side of that screen. It was past midnight, and my heart raced with dread as I barged in, flipping on the light. What I found stopped me cold. Leo sat in the center of his bed, the tablet illuminating his face, but the screen was static, a blank void. "Who were you talking to?" I demanded, But he just smiled, a smile that wasn't his own, and said, "They don't like it when you interrupt." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but he said it so innocently, a child's face masking something that felt profoundly wrong. I unplugged the tablet, seizing it from him, but in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something dark and desperate. When I finally tucked him into bed that night, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows skulked in the corners of the room, whispering secrets I couldn't decipher. That next morning, Leo was gone. Only the tablet remained, sitting on his desk, the screen now bright and taunting, images rapidly changing like a slideshow gone haywire. I rushed to the police, but as they combed the neighborhood, whispers of Leo's disappearance echoed in my ears, enveloping me in despair. As weeks bled into each other, I couldn't help but drift back to that tablet. Maybe it had something to do with him vanishing. In a moment of desperation, I fired it up again, scrolling through eerie images of children lost and distorted in shades of gray. As I read frantic messages left by parents pleading for help, I realized something deeply unsettling. There were stories of children claiming to have met friends in the pixels, eager to take them away to a land filled with laughter, but the parents who rushed to confront their children found nothing but emptiness, empty beds, empty rooms, the only evidence left behind being the sinister devices that had stolen them. The hours I spent with that cursed tablet rewired something in my mind. Each flash of color felt like a beckoning, drawing me deeper until I couldn't tell where reality ended and the digital nightmare began. In my waking life, I felt Leo's absence like a gaping wound, and the further I delved into the tablet, the more I could almost hear his laughter echoing from somewhere just beyond reach. I started to question where I was meant to belong. Was I still a mother, or just another soul lost in the void? Desperate to understand what happened, I searched for answers until one night, the device surged to life, displaying a message, "Come play with us." It was so simple, yet my heart raced. I knew I should be terrified, yet the promise of catching a fleeting glimpse of my son ensnared me. Casting aside caution, I typed into a chat window, "Where is Leo?" The reply came instantaneously, "He's having fun, don't you want to join him?" Just like that, I was sucked into a spiral of avatars and animations that twisted and turned, colors blending into melodies of eerie laughter, and suddenly, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was standing in a vibrant world filled with those children, the ones who had disappeared, their faces stretched in joyful ecstasy. "Stay with us," they chirped in unison, encircling me before I realized how much older I felt amidst their youthful energy. Panic surged through me when I saw Leo at the center, a mere silhouette lost in throes of laughter, beckoning me to join him. I called out, but my voice felt far away, and I couldn't move towards him. "Mommy, don't go," he cried, but the others grabbed me, holding me tight, and I started to feel myself fading, the colors consuming me, wrapping around me like shrouds. I cried out again, but the laughter swallowed my voice whole, turning it into static. Just as I thought I would be lost forever, I yanked myself away, stumbling backward, and with a single flick of resolve, I destroyed the tablet, smashing it against the hardwood floor until it lay in generations of shattered glass, opportunity and darkness spilling out like secrets under the weight of truth. I fell to my knees, exhausted and broken, clinging to the last remnants of reality. I thought I'd saved Leo, yet the voices lingered in the corners of my mind, whispering sweet nothings and entreaties. I never wanted to touch another screen in my life, but now I lie awake in my bed, the stillness punctuated only by my heartbeat, and every night, I wait in utter silence for the moment the shadows surge, bringing with them the haunting laughter of children lost and my son's voice calling for me, knowing I might be the next one to disappear into the void they made for little souls like mine. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as fatigue, an odd glitch in my routine, maybe. It was a Tuesday night, the kind when the world outside my window seemed to retain an unsettling stillness, like a predator waiting to pounce on its prey. As I huddled on my couch, scrolling through my social media feeds, I noticed something strange, the perfectly timed ads that seemed to know my thoughts, the offhand comments from friends and strangers alike that echoed my innermost fears. I shrugged it off and turned off my phone, only to feel the familiar buzz of an incoming notification. The ground shook, not in earthquakes, but in an unnerving resonance within my ribs, vibrating right to where I was seated. I peeked out the window, but the streets looked the same, silent and cozy beneath the streetlights. Days turned into weeks, and the peculiarities piled up like snowdrifts on my doorstep, bright red cars passing by only to vanish as if erased from existence, the sound of laughter from children that never seemed to have a source, bleary faces of passers-by that all wore expressions of shared secret knowledge that I wasn't privy to. I began to feel like I was an extra in a film I didn't understand, Every pedestrian and actor rehearsing a script long before I arrived on the set. One night, as the paranoia unfurled its icy tendrils around my sanity, I overheard two men talking on the street as I stepped out for some fresh air. They looked generic, all nondescript jackets and ball caps, but what chilled my blood was their conversation. It sounded like they were discussing me. "Did you see how he looked at the camera?" one said. "He's questioning the code. We can't let him find out." My heart raced as goosebumps erupted on my skin. I wanted to shout at them, to run, to hide. Instead, I slipped back into my house, locking the door with trembling hands, the edges of my vision swimming in panic. It wasn't long before reality started to chip away at its borders. I would be at a coffee shop, and the same barista would serve me every day at the same hour, yet each day, she'd say something slightly different. "Here you go. Your usual." One day, "And are you trying something new today?" The next, despite my order never changing. I wondered if they were all watching me, all playing me like a game character, feeding on my confusion. I sought solace in the digital world, perhaps desperately thinking that if this was some program or simulation, I could hack some control back. I downloaded every conspiracy theory forum I could find, drowning my mind in the chilling possibilities. A string of late-night rabbit holes led me to discussions of the reality scientists spoke about, of simulations that could be constructed to keep human subjects unaware of their confinement. Every post concluded with ominous suggestions: keep your camera off, trust no one, never share your location. I became a phantom in my own life, venturing further into isolated corners of the web where like-minded souls converged. Then one night, the screen dimmed, turning to a solid black as if someone had clicked end on the world I knew. I was alone, unmoored. I looked at the mirror and barely recognized myself. The face that stared back wore a distant, hollow expression that burned with shocking awareness. "What if I'm not real?" the figure whispered. That thought wrapped around my neck like a noose, squeezing tighter until the next day, something snapped. I ventured outside again, drawn by the need for truth, my footsteps echoing on the pavement which seemed too sterile, too calculated. I walked through the park, watching the same people repeat patterns that felt rehearsed, and beneath the noise of laughter and chatting lies a dissonant hum like a malfunctioning machine. I saw one woman who flipped her hair, a simple gesture, but it felt like a coded signal. My heart raced in recognition of a trigger that shifted something inside fucking me up, breaking my focus on the facade. I ran to her, gripped by a primal urge to know, to prove to myself that I was still real as I yelled out her name, though I didn't know it. She turned, the joyful spark in her eyes vanished as if someone had erased her. Her lips moved, forming something that was clearly not any language I could decipher, and yet I understood its meaning in my bone marrow. "This is not real." She sunk into the ground, leaving a ripple in reality, and my world splintered. I stumbled backward, feeling the ground dissolve beneath my feet, dragging me into the infinite space between what was and what might not exist at all. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the darkness swallowing up echoes of that encounter, my sanity teetering against this dizzy, digital void. Days after, the details blurred but the sentiments sharpened. What is reality if not a fluid construct shaped by perception? At work, my co-workers moved from room to room, and the world outside my gaze felt warped, the colors unnaturally vivid, the shadows reaching at strange angles, stretching out like claws attempting to grasp my very existence. I couldn't tell if I saw reflection or projection. The border between my mind and the universe felt indistinguishable, a line washed away with each passing moment. So, I began a new endeavor. I printed signs, calling out to anyone who felt the imbalance, who experienced the flickering of walls, the glitching of time, who had seen the unseen nodes of reality glitch in front of them. I walked from cafe to cafe and stapled these sheets onto bulletin boards, hoping to reach someone, anyone. Waking up, they proclaimed in bold letters alongside cryptic drawings of twisted faces, redacted timelines, inviting whispers for those lost in the phantoms of everyday life to come together. But the response was hollow. Empty walls reflected my desperation, and reality stretched thin around me like icing on a cake, constantly spun and cracking. I finally returned home, staring at the light streaming through my window, feeling cold fingertips tracing the small of my back, but this time, I knew it wasn't just paranoia. I closed my eyes, willing myself to slip free of this incessant loop. I didn't know what I was searching for, but the urge to escape grew like an echo in a dream I couldn't shake off. It was then I choked, gasping for breath. And in the stillness of that suffocating shell, I felt it return, a distortion in the air, a rip in the fabric of something I wasn't sure was real. As I opened my eyes, a message flickered on my phone screen: "You are one of us now." It was a message from a stranger, and beneath it, a deep, lurking fear coiled tighter, waiting for me to untangle the truth or be consumed whole by this living nightmare that felt more real than anything ever had. I swallowed hard, realizing that I was diving deeper into a reality that seemed determined to swallow me whole. I had become part of the experiment, and there was no escaping it. The game had just begun, and I was the unwitting player in the most twisted augmented reality one could imagine, forever questioning if I was the one holding the controller or if, in the end, I was just another flickering shadow waiting for deletion. I flashed an old lady at the grocery store today, and before you get any twisted ideas, let me clarify, it wasn't intentional, and it wasn't what you think. I was just trying to grab a bag of flour from the top shelf when I lost my grip and the whole thing came tumbling down. The bag exploded at my feet, sending a plume of white powder into the air like a volcanic eruption of baking needs, clouds enveloping me and leaving everything in a soft, eerie fog. When the dust settled, I found myself standing amidst a scene that could only be described as chaos, flour blanketing the ground, my mouth tasting like I had swallowed an entire bag of pancake mix, and the shocked gasps mixed with stifled laughter echoing through the aisles. That's when I turned to see her, an elderly lady, standing just a few feet away, her jaw dropped and eyes wide in disbelief or maybe disgust. For a split second, I imagined that my embarrassing moment was simply a benign encounter, harmless and funny in its own right. I was still chuckling at the absurdity of it all when I caught sight of the expression on her face as she stared at my flour-coated shirt and the explosion remnants surrounding me. Just as I was about to apologize, she opened her mouth, and what came out sent a chill through my spine. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low yet steady, each word slow and deliberate. It seemed impossible to connect that expression with anything else. It felt almost ominous, like she wasn't speaking about the flour but something much deeper. I took a step back, feeling a crawling sensation creeping up my skin, and suddenly taking another one felt like a mistake. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her. Her eyes, once filled with amusement, now held something darker, a knowing glance that sparked the most primal of fears within me. It was unsettling, how she positioned her hand against the cart, her knuckles clenching tight around the handle, and the grocery list hanging limply from her wrinkled fingers. I turned to leave, thinking maybe if I just ignored the whole incident, it would go away, but she spoke again, her voice like syrup pouring over a wound. "They're watching you," she warned, and that was it. My heart raced, my instinct screamed to flee, but I felt like I was anchored to the ground, a bizarre mix of curiosity and dread rooting me in place. I scanned the store for anyone staring, but everyone else was wrapped up in their own worlds. Then her finger pointed past me, and I turned just in time to see a tall figure lurking at the end of the aisle. Shadows danced around him, twisting his features enough that I couldn't make out any details. But the cold sweat that erupted on my skin froze me in place. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the old lady's stark warning. Was I imagining things? Was this a setup for some hidden camera prank show? The figure began to move closer, dread clenching my stomach as I frantically took stock of the situation. You would think that I'd run, arms flailing like a madman, but instead, I found myself standing there like a deer in headlights, unable to process why I didn't just walk away from this bizarre confrontation. The old lady chuckled softly, then her laugh turned into a croak like something ugly unfolding inside her. "Please, don't hurt him," she said, her eyes suddenly glistening with tears, and that inexplicable fear rose again. I wasn't sure if the figure was friend or foe, whether it was some gimmick from the universe aimed at punishing me for my earlier embarrassment. I twisted away, ready to bolt from this bizarre scene, but as I took a step, she reached out and touched my forearm with surprising strength for someone who seemed so frail, holding me there, anchoring me to this terrifying loop of uncertainty. "You'll find him again," she whispered, each word curling into my ear like smoke, and something about her tone suggested that, deep down, she believed it. Goosebumps erupted on my skin, and her grip tightened as if she might force something out of me, something evil or something true, but I was lost in the panic of it all. In my head, all I could think about was escape, but I glanced over at the figure again and realized they weren't coming toward me anymore. They turned and started walking away, blending into the shadows as if they were nothing more than a lost dream. But the old woman wouldn't let go. "You'll understand soon." "The flower," she whispered again, and before I could comprehensively think about what she had said, I yanked my arm loose and sprinted down the aisle. I could hear her faint laughter lingering behind me, growing louder, echoing like a haunting tune as I raced toward the exit. Outside, the sun was shining bright, the normalcy of it seemed to clash violently with the madness I had just encountered. I hurried to my car, fumbling to unlock it as images from that strange encounter licked at the edges of my focus. I screamed at myself internally to calm down as I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so much I nearly dropped the keys. I couldn't shake off what she'd said, her ominous warning embedded in my mind like a tattoo that refused to fade. And still, as I sat in my car, I glanced over to the entrance of the store, and that figure was standing there again, their back turned to me, and an unmistakable chill slithered down my spine. The old lady's laughter echoed in my head, and a new realization flashed through me: she wasn't just talking about the flower, she was referring to something more profound, something related to the figure that I was sure I'd never laid eyes on before. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, but the moment I turned the key to the ignition, I could swear I had caught snippets of her laughter echoing through the fabric of reality itself. It twisted like a blend of innocence lost in somber tones, and even with the engine sputtering to life, I felt the suffocating grip of a haunting truth tightening around my chest. I needed to get away from that store, away from that figure, away from her bizarre grip of prophecy, but even now as I drive home, with every mile, I could feel the insidious gnawing that this was only the beginning of something far more twisted, that maybe my mundane embarrassment would spiral and reconnect with something darker lurking behind the ordinary, and I hated the sinking feeling that I would find myself reliving this moment if I wasn't careful. I didn't know how, but that old lady's words echoed like an untouchable truth, promising that I would soon uncover the real reason I shouldn't have done what I did today.
I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. My curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the two boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore, their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what it was, what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "AITA for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me.
I am under the influence of cannabis probably 15 out of 24 hours a day. Every day. Initially, it was just a way to cope with the noise, the chaos of an urban life that seemed to drown out any semblance of peace. I started with small puffs shared among friends, laughter spilling into the sultry summer evenings like the smoke that curled above us, but I soon slipped down a rabbit hole of dependence, craving the blissful haze that separated me from the world and my relentless thoughts. Somehow, each day began to blend into the next, an endless loop of green euphoria that dulled any emotional edge, and soon enough, it morphed from joy to a daily ritual. I lost count of how many times I lit up before breakfast, the smell of burnt herb mingling with eggs and coffee, and that warm, fuzzy embrace wrapped around me like a blanket, lulling me into a sweet stupor that I convinced myself was normal. My reflection began to change, the vibrant hues of life fading to a dull pastel that echoed the smoke spiraling above my head. Friends fell away, too, one by one, their laughter replaced by concerned glimpses as I sank deeper into this comforting cocoon, dismissing their worries with a casual wave, clutching my pipe like a talisman. I began to drift into thoughts that felt disjointed and strange, arguments with the voices in my head that grew louder in the stillness, their insistence piercing through the thick cloud that enveloped me. They whispered darkly, filled with scorn, reminding me of every missed opportunity and every shred of ambition I had allowed to wilt in favor of this sluggish existence. And in that distorted haze, I felt myself fraying. At night, when the world outside grew still beneath the blanket of midnight, the whispers morphed into something else entirely. They transformed into figures, cloaked in shadows that loomed just at the edge of my peripheral vision, feeling more tangible with each drag I took. My apartment became a labyrinth of unfamiliar faces and fleeting fears mingled with sweet cannabis dreams, and I could no longer discern if they were real or merely figments of my mind, a manifestation of my guilt and isolation. Simple tasks like showering and eating became monumental challenges, overtaken by the thrum of dread that pulsed beneath the surface, awakening once I extinguished my joint. I began to avoid mirrors, fearful of acknowledging the hollow-eyed stranger who inhabited my body. Friends stopped visiting, replaced by operative drifters I'd invite over in search of human connection, but soon realized they shared the same haze, their laughter echoing hollowly in the darkness of my mind. One rainy Thursday, the sky wept in tune with my thoughts, a perfect reflection of my internal turmoil, and I sank deeper into my sofa, convinced I had become invisible beneath the swirling clouds of my own making. It wasn't until the tapping began, a light knock one night, that startled me from the warm embrace of my weed fog, echoing through the silence of my apartment. At first, I dismissed it, chalking it up to my wild imagination, swirling shadows in the corners, but the knocking persisted, steady and unrelenting, as if someone stood outside my door quietly pleading for entry. Heart racing, I cowered into my sofa, focused on the relentless sound, sweat pooling at my brow while my mind prepared to fall deeper into the rabbit hole. Each knock grew louder, urging me to confront whatever was out there, but dread knew me well by this point, wrapping around my throat, choking the courage from my chest. Anxiety bloomed within me. It could be the police, or worse, a former friend come to confront me about my spiraling addiction, but when I finally mustered the strength to peek through the peephole, I recoiled. The figure outside was gaunt and twisted, with an impossibly elongated face that bore a crooked grin, yet it looked unsettlingly familiar. It was an uncanny echo of myself, but hollowed, eyes sunken deep into its skull, staring at me with an unsettling hunger. I stumbled back, grabbing my stash in a panic at the sight of that ethereal monstrosity and the horrific realization that perhaps I had become a charred reflection of my true self, everything that I had loved stripped away. I sprinted to the window, desperate to escape reality as I methodically rolled the spliff to soothe the panic rising in my chest, but as I inhaled deeply and the smoke rose, so did a flood of faces, those long-gone friends circling my consciousness with pity and disgust, their laughter echoing hauntingly as they faded into my mind's eye. Just as I thought I might choke on the smoke, I caught a glimpse of a flicker outside the window, and there it was again, that familiar face looming outside, pulling on my heartstrings, gasping for life as the shadows thrummed and twisted. In a daze of panic, I grasped my phone, fumbling to call for help, desperate to shatter this web of psyche and reclaim what was left of me, but the screen wouldn't illuminate. The faces outside were swarming now, reaching out with elongated fingers, and all at once, the porch light flickered and went out. I could hear whispers resounding all around me, beckoning, pleading with a voice that sounded so much like my own, begging me to join them in their suffocating embrace. I crushed my spliff against the edge of the table, smoke curling around me, and as I contemplated whether I'd lost my mind entirely or if there was still a flicker of the person I used to be trapped inside the haze, the knuckles rapped once more against my door with a finality I could no longer take. The door trembled under the weight of my fears, pressing against the fragile wall between me and that grotesque reflection of myself, and as I felt the darkness closing in, a sickening certainty washed over me. I was neither alive nor dead, I was forever suspended in between, hidden under the influence of my own devices.
I still remember the night I found myself sitting in the dimly lit corner of that upscale restaurant, the air thick with the scent of rich herbs and roasted meats, a place that had been a favorite haunt for my wife and me since our early days of marriage. It was a peaceful evening, the clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs wrapping around us like a soft blanket, until I noticed him, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sitting 2 tables down, engaged in an animated conversation with his friends, his laughter piercing through the serenity like a jackhammer. After a couple of minutes, my frustration began to bubble as he leaned back in his chair, balancing precariously on the rear legs, treating the fine dining experience like a raucous college party. I exchanged glances with my wife, who was trying to enjoy her crème brûlée, but the escalating volume of the young man's voice was unbearable. He leaned back further, tilting the chair back grotesquely, and for a split second, I could swear he was trying to show off, perhaps reliving some frat party glory days in this place that felt far too classy for such antics. It was one thing to laugh and share a good time, but this felt disrespectful, a blatant disregard for the ambience meticulously crafted by the staff. I wouldn't have intervened if it weren't for that moment when he stood up, raising his arms above his head in what could only be described as a triumphant pose, as if celebrating the success of a prank, and I snapped. Without thinking, I leaned forward, my voice firm yet calm. "Could you sit down, please?" The sudden tension wrapped around us like a noose, his laughter fading and curiosity sparked in the eyes of other diners who glanced in our direction. The young man turned to me, a mixture of surprise and disdain washing over his features, and for a moment, I thought he might explode with that youthful arrogance that comes so easily in that age. Instead, he slowly lowered his arms and sank back into his chair, a pout forming as if I had stolen his spotlight. After a few seconds of incredulous silence, his friends erupted in laughter, mockery spilling out in waves, making the atmosphere thicker still. I could feel my ears burning with embarrassment, but I held my ground, silently staring back, until the waiter approached, an unsure smile on his face, and asked if everything was all right. My wife cleared her throat and gave me a look that screamed why. I smiled awkwardly, as if I were somehow the villain in this scene, but I justified my actions. Etiquette must be respected, right? I glanced back at the group and noticed something unsettling. The young man's eyes no longer met mine, but fixated on something behind me. I turned to look, half expecting to see an imposing figure, but there was just a shadow, a flicker of something, a person perhaps, but I shrugged it off as mere paranoia, the tension in the room seeming almost palpable. The young man, now quiet, seemed to sink into the moment, returning to his typical demeanor, but I noticed the flickers in his eyes were growing more ravenous, more unstable. I thought I had controlled the situation, but something felt off, the way he kept glancing around the restaurant now, not in embarrassment or irritation but with a strange, almost fearful curiosity. When he finally stood again, it was not for another triumphant show-off but rather a nervous fidget, and that's when the place grew quiet again, all eyes glued to him, waiting, and that included mine. He stepped away from the table, his friends still oblivious as they flirted with their cocktails, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was drawn to the far corner of the restaurant, as if he sensed something lurking in the shadows. I leaned in toward my wife, whispering that something was strange, that I didn't like this, but she rolled her eyes, insisting I let it go. I couldn't. I watched him approach the window, the lights creating a halo around his head as if illuminating his path to whatever was pulling him toward that darkness outside. Suddenly, he leaned closer to the glass, peering out as if he were staring into another realm, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Just then, the lights flickered, casting the room into a brief panic of shadows, and I swear I saw something flash across his face, fear, excitement, then despair all at once. He backed away as if he had seen something that struck dread, his breath quickening, and I couldn't help but think maybe I had crossed a line by speaking up. The restaurant's hum resumed, the wait staff doing their best to maintain a charade of normalcy, but I couldn't shake that pulsing feeling growing in my gut, eerie and foreboding, as if some ancient curse had awoken from a long slumber. Everything was wrong now, from the decor to the polished silverware. The laughter felt hollow, as though a specter had begun to swirl amongst us, lingering on the edge of our consciousness. When he gradually approached his table again, now visibly on edge, something inside me braced for impact. Would he explode? Would he retaliate against my outburst? Instead, in a soft yet firm voice, he muttered something to his friends, and one of them laughed, unaware of how close to breaking he really was. With each second, I felt the weight of dread crawl closer as his laughter turned into an awkward silence, punctuated only by the creaking of wood beneath chairs and the clinking of glasses. In that moment, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of guilt, a gut-wrenching realization. I had triggered this young man's descent into madness with a simple command to sit down, and as the clock ticked, I felt myself pulled deeper into a spiral of dread and regret, trapped in a moment that spiraled out of control until finally the shadows closed in on us all, and I wondered if I had just unleashed something dark, if perhaps it was I, the one ironically sitting down, who had finally surrendered to the sinister undercurrents of the world, forever marked by the terror of simply trying to enforce a semblance of civility.
I was 12 years old when my parents took me to Six Flags, a place that seemed like a kingdom of joy where laughter soared and screams mingled with the whir of roller coasters slicing through the sky, a paradise that turned into a nightmare that remains etched in my mind. The day started like any other. We rushed through crowds of excited families, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy swirling like a sugary fog. I remember my bright yellow t-shirt, its fabric slightly sticky with melting ice cream. I should have known the innocence of my childhood thrill would be robbed that day. We spent hours running from ride to ride, the adrenaline fueling our laughter, until I spotted the spiral of the Ferris wheel glistening in the sunlight. That wheel became my retreat, a slice of solitude amidst the chaos. There was a line, but my attention wandered to a corner of the park, a dimly lit arcade that seemed to call out to me with its flashing lights and the magnetic clinks of tokens. I excused myself from my parents and ventured inside, the noise of the park fading to a muffled hum. Inside, a group of older boys congregated near a racing game, their laughter echoing with something darker, something foreboding that made the hairs on my neck stand. They looked at me with a predatory gleam in their eyes, though I didn't understand the danger just yet. I played a game or two, reveling in the flickering pixelated glory, blissfully unaware as the shadows grew longer and the arcade grew warmer, like a heavy blanket I couldn't shake. That's when I felt a tug at my shirt, and there he was, a man in his late 20s, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low, his eyes hidden in shadow. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that chilled my spine, making me feel small in a way that made me subconsciously take a step back as he leaned into my space. "Hey there, kiddo, you want to join the fun?" I remember being too scared to respond, feeling a pulse of danger that cracked like static in the air. Somehow, I nodded, and he rewarded my compliance with a sinister grin. We stepped out of the arcade, the vibrant chaos of the amusement park feeling distant, obscured by the growing sense of unease that curled like smoke inside me. He led me to a secluded area behind a food stall, away from prying eyes and cheerful laughter that now seemed foreign. It felt wrong, but my youthful naivety blinded me to the gravity of the situation until it was too late. I can't recall the specifics, but I remember the overwhelming sense of panic as the world moved around me in slow motion. His grip was like iron, and I was powerless to break free. I managed to scream, but sound was swallowed by the cacophony of the festival behind us. I thought I'd die right there. It felt like a vacuum, sucking all the joy out of the world while leaving an echo of horror in its place as shadows danced mockingly around me. When I finally escaped, it felt like I emerged from a fog. I stumbled through the crowd, trying to find my family, desperately searching for safety amidst the cheerful, oblivious strangers. I don't remember how long I searched. Time twisted around me, stretching seconds into an eternity. By the time I found my parents at the log flume, I was drenched in sweat and trembling. I didn't tell them anything, the words lodged in my throat like sharp glass. Each time I tried to speak it felt like I was choking on the memories that refused to settle. I wanted to scream it, to tell them the monster I had encountered, but the shame of not being strong enough, of letting something so sinister touch my innocence sealed my lips. The rest of the day I forced myself to smile through the fear, to pretend that the world hadn't shattered around me, but every laughter wove a thread of paranoia, turning every face I saw into a potential threat. Finally, we left the park. The drive home felt eternal, the weight of the secret suffocating the air in the car. Night fell, and every shadow loomed larger, breathing darkness into my thoughts. Sleepless nights followed. I saw his face in the dark, twisted and grotesque, lurking just beyond my vision. I picked apart the memories like fragile wings, trying to make sense of my experience, fearing what I might uncover, while it tortured me that I hadn't told anyone, that I had let it happen. Each sound in the dead of night would send me scrambling for the bed covers, the shadows weaving tales of what could have been, what could still be. I tried to return to normalcy, but the innocence lost clung to me, a ghost that shadowed every interaction, scaring me away from new friendships for fear of betrayal and mistrust. Middle school became a labyrinth of paralyzing anxiety. Every corner held echoes of that day, whispers of laughter turned sinister, and I recoiled into myself, isolating until joy withered in the weight of dread. Years passed without resolution, but the trauma stained my psyche deeply, entwining itself into every aspect of life like a noxious vine. I didn't understand why something from that day haunted me until I stumbled across a thread online, stories shared among voices like mine, struggling to raise awareness against abuses hidden in plain sight. Reading accounts from others, I felt a flicker of courage spawn within. I began to connect the dots, engage and confront my painful past. Varying responses echoed back, some shared in empathy while others urged silence, and I still was torn, caught between wanting to cry out for justice and cowering in the shadows. At a therapy session, I finally confronted the fear that had clouded me for so long, revealing the haunting experience, the things that had robbed me of childhood joy. It was incredibly freeing yet so terrifying to release the fears trapped within as they tumbled out like marbles from a spilled bag. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of that experience was the realization that libel or rumors could tarnish my own name even through an eradicated past. As I learned to navigate the emotional minefield, I still face more questions than answers, like should I confront the fears of my past and reach out to that monster? Would he even remember me, or had I become just another lost child among his predatory roll of distant memories? The clock ticks on the possibility of recapturing innocence lost in that day, and while I work through the lasting effects, I have learned something crucial: shadows never stay buried in the dark, and though the past is a haunting specter, I refuse to let it control me. What I once caught in darkness is now bound in light, and perhaps, in time, my story can help others break free of their quiet demons and dare to illuminate the truth. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, but the lure of quick steam points became an obsession I couldn't resist. You see, I was living paycheck to paycheck, my gaming habits slowly suffocating my bank account, and then, one dark evening during a particularly grueling half-hearted scroll through the gaming subreddits, I stumbled across a thread titled "The Dark Side of Digital Services," where users claimed you could earn Steam points by completing increasingly bizarre tasks for anonymous clients, the kinds of things you'd never tell your friends about. Curiosity nagging at my mind, I clicked on it, and after some convincing shadowy exchanges in private messages, I found myself chatting with someone who insisted they would pay handsomely for an intimate digital experience, and while my gut twisted at the implications, my desire for the newest game release overshadowed my better judgment, so I agreed, not really understanding what it would entail. They sent me a series of instructions, a bizarre script filled with euphemisms and gamer slang, absolutely ridiculous language that felt more akin to a crude fan fiction than anything else, but the promise of 10,000 Steam points burned in my mind like a neon sign at a pitch-black intersection, leading me deeper into madness, and after exchanging a few lines of banter, I was thrusting my fingers over my keyboard in a dance of embarrassment, typing out phrases that made my face burn hotter than 1,000 suns as they sent me back more and more intense requests, and despite the ludicrousness of it all, I found myself more engaged as they would ping my overlay, turning every mundane word into a slow spiral of absurdity and titillation. But then the playful tone suddenly shifted when they began asking for personal details, a name, a location, anything that could anchor them to me. I hesitated, the weight of secrecy and shame resting on my shoulders, sensing something dark lurking just behind the curtain of the virtual world, but the allure of those points beckoned me deeper, stronger than any moral compass I might have had, and against my better judgment, I tossed out a detail or two, light and whimsical, even convincing myself it was all harmless fun. That's when the atmosphere warped, the chat abruptly turning sour as this faceless user began sending unsettling messages, demanding I validate my commitment with ludicrous claims of digital domination, culminating in a request that twisted my stomach, insisting that I literally acknowledge their control over me by performing the outlandish tasks they had in mind in some twisted livestream format, and the fear sank in. But then I saw the digits flash before me. I had exchanged the virtual for the tangible, hovering over the prompts that would unlock my points, and in the depths of indecision I acquiesced, cringing back on my desk chair, the tingling sense of dread solidifying the reality of my decision. I prepared to do something I had never imagined myself capable of, my heart racing as I reached that point of no return, anxiety mixing with utter embarrassment. But it didn't feel like I was losing my dignity as much as unraveling the essence of my humanity in front of a nameless stranger who would be able to drown my soul through electric currents and pixelated screens. And just as I finally typed the last line, the screen flickered ominously, an error message dancing angrily before me. But before I could backpedal, the last prompt appeared, covered in a sinister red hue, demanding not just the performance but the account switch as well. Suddenly, I wasn't just giving of myself digitally, I was being pulled into a web where my identity bled into pixels and lines of code, becoming a disposable identity at the mercy of some twisted puppeteer, and panic lifted me from my seat as I tried to disconnect, desperately attempting to shut down my laptop, but the screen wouldn't respond, the keys now sticky under my trembling fingers as a sinister laugh echoed through my speakers, sending chills coursing through me, heart pounding louder than the voice in my head warning me to run. It felt like the room began to swirl around me as I struggled for control. But that's when I saw it, the user presence becoming a solid ghost in the chat, an ominous series of numbers near my digital footprint, and the final message glowed incandescently, a chilling ultimatum: you wanted the points, but what are you willing to lose to keep your account? It's time to make a deal.
I never thought Thanksgiving would be the day everything would unravel, but here we are, just a few days away from the holiday when my brother decided to bring his new girlfriend into the family fold. Now, Logan had always been a bit impulsive, jumping from one relationship to another like a child on a trampoline, but this new girl, Tara, was something else. Our family is tight-knit, built on love and respect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It started a few weeks ago at a family barbecue. Tara showed up uninvited, slinking into our backyard in a low-cut dress and high heels, her laughter too loud and forced. I remember my wife, Sarah, greeting her with a warm smile, the kind that melts the heart, but Tara, with a dismissive wave, merely rolled her eyes, shooting back a caustic remark about how basic the whole event was. I felt the atmosphere freeze, Sarah's smile faltered, and the warmth of family quickly turned to awkwardness, the kind you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone's just been insulted in a room where everyone should feel safe. Despite the tension, I shrugged it off. Relationships take time, maybe she was just a little too much wine and not enough maturity. But then, the comments kept coming. It was like she had a vendetta against my wife, each word woven into a tapestry of disdain. At the next family gathering, she brought up how funny it was that I had the same job for 5 years, as if my dedication to our family's financial security was laughable, but, of course, Logan, ever the oblivious one, just laughed along. My heart raced as I watched Sarah's face contort with hurt. I approached Logan later and voiced my concerns, but he dismissed me, insisting I was being overprotective. It escalated from there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I made it clear, Tara wasn't welcome at our Thanksgiving dinner. This was a day for family, love, and gratitude, not taunts and jabs at the dinner table. When I broke the news to Logan, he went quiet, his face morphing into disbelief and anger, like I'd slapped him. "You can't just dictate who I can date," he exploded, red-faced and incensed. I stood my ground. "I'm not dictating anything, I'm protecting my family." Our conversation devolved into a fight, complete with accusations of me being controlling and unfair. It spiraled until we were both shouting, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, that I was pushing him away. But then he brought Sarah into it, saying that if she couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe I shouldn't have married her. That hit harder than any insult Tara had thrown, and I felt an icy rage boil inside me. Thanksgiving came, the air crisp and chilly, and I still buzzed with anger. Sarah was tentative around me, unsure of how to ease the tension brewing like a storm above our family eagle's nest, as she called it. I thought about all that Tara had put her through, how she had disrespected the very foundation of our lives together. The day of Thanksgiving dawned bright, but the shadow of the upcoming confrontation loomed large. I spent the day cooking, the sense of turkey and stuffing filling our home, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Logan, wondering if he'd take the high road or wash his hands of our family tradition. Then, the doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. There he stood, all confident bravado, with Tara clinging to his arm like a leech. I opened the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hey, Logan. Happy Thanksgiving," I said, already regretting every bit of small talk that was about to ensue. "Thanks, man, good to see you," he replied, his voice leeching with tension as he glanced at my face for any sign of approval. Tara, however, was a different story. Rather than grace myself with a simple hello, she leaned in close to me and whispered, "You're really upset I'm here, aren't you, sweetie?" In a tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. I could taste the bile rising in my throat as the words hung thick in the air. I forced a laugh, but inside, I was battling the monster of rage swarming my insides. I ushered them inside and busied myself with the preparations, Sarah already setting the table with an uncharacteristically somber expression. Tara breezed around the house, commenting on the decorations, how they looked cheap, as if she had any room to talk, and I was ready to snap. Dinner came, and we all settled down, tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Small talk morphed into a battlefield, and as Tara consumed her plate, every word dripped with thinly veiled mockery directed at my wife until Sarah excused herself and left the table. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, and something inside me snapped. I stood up so hard my chair toppled over. "Tara, if you can't show my wife respect in her own home, you don't deserve to be here and neither does Logan," I spat, all of my pent-up frustration exploding in a mixture of protective love and seething anger. The table fell silent, forks frozen in midair, as Logan shot out of his chair, flaring with indignation. "You're being unreasonable. She's my girlfriend," he screamed, the table shaking under the weight of his fury. But it was Tara that caught me off guard when she leaned back and said, honestly, "Your life sounds pathetic. I feel sorry for your wife." My heart dropped like lead, the air became thick with something heavy. Was it hatred or contempt? I took a breath, steadying myself. "You're right, Tara, I do feel sorry for you. You've managed to entangle yourself with a man who clearly doesn't see the damage you're doing. Logan looked stricken, staring between us, torn. That was when I reached my breaking point, turning to him and saying, "You deserve better than this, and so does she. I'm not the bad guy here, you are. I'll choose family over a petty squabble with a woman who can't respect my wife." I suddenly felt hollow and exposed, a dark mantle of anger and shame wrapping around me. Logan shook his head in fury, and I saw a ripple of realization cross his face, the anger twisting into a profound confusion. Tara stood there, smugly, as if to say she had just won a twisted game of chess where she expected to claim the crown. That's when I kicked them out, a moment that felt both immensely satisfying and eviscerating at the same time. I slammed the door behind them, breathing heavily, my heart racing faster than it had in years as I faced the fallout. I turned to find Sarah framed in the kitchen doorway, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions, pride, sadness, and relief, all tangled into a sorrowful smile. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as we held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I knew we could withstand anything, while all I could think about was whether I had chosen rightly for my family. Maybe I wasn't in the wrong after all. The evening faded into laughter, warmth, and heads bowed in thanks, filled with new traditions where respect governed the values we all held dear. A thin veil hung over the doorway where resentment no longer dared cross.
I sit alone at the bar, 3 empty glasses in front of me and a fourth almost finished, the amber liquid swirling enticingly like the thoughts that dance in my mind, and in the background, the muted sounds of clinking glasses and hushed conversations wrap around me like a warm blanket. It's so peaceful here, nearly intoxicating in its stillness. A welcome respite from the chaos of my life outside, where I can't escape the screech of demands and judgments from my fast-paced job. But as I allow the effects of alcohol to lull me deeper into this cocoon of solitude, an unfamiliar face catches my eye from across the bar. She's strikingly beautiful, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders as she sits quietly, seemingly savoring her own drink, and I can't help but wonder what solitude means to her, if it's as comforting as it is to me. Just as I consider getting up to speak to her, she glances over and our eyes meet for a heartbeat, her gaze heavy with something I can't quite place, a flicker of recognition perhaps, but it vanishes as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a vacant stare as she returns to her drink, and I'm left feeling like an intruder in this moment of peacefulness I thought was entirely mine. On impulse, I order another round, my heart racing as I watch her, when suddenly the other patrons start to shift uncomfortably. It's subtle at first, a slight withdrawal of laughter, a nervous glance shared among pairs of eyes, and I can feel the air thickening with tension that seemed to seep from the very walls, as if the bar itself is holding its breath. And then, without warning, the lights flicker, plunging us into darkness for a brief second before returning. But when they do, everything is different. I look around, confused, and notice, not just the murmurs of concern, but a deep chill that seems to seep into my bones as I turn back to the woman. But she's no longer sitting there, her bar still empty as if she had vanished into thin air, and in that moment, I feel an unsettling presence crawling up my spine, an instinct urging me to leave, yet I'm rooted in place, drawn instead to the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. There she is again, but now she's standing, pale as moonlight, and I swear there's something wrong about her, something off-kilter, like a distorted echo of the woman who just moments ago sat across from me, and before I can look away, she leans closer to the mirror, her lips moving in a silent plea that raises the hairs on my neck. I blink rapidly, hoping to shake off the sense of dread that clings to me, and when I glance back, she's gone. The other patrons returning to their drinks as though nothing happened, but they are different too, their voices an airy chorus of laughter that vibrates strangely in my ears, and I can't escape the growing urgency to leave. Yet when I rise and push through the first wave of patrons, something stops me, an unknown force, a tight grip in my chest whispers that this moment is important, that I don't understand what's happening, but it feels like I'm on the precipice of something monumental. I manage to catch sight of an older man seated at the far end of the bar, his vacant stare fixed on a drink that hasn't moved in what seems like hours, and against my better judgment, I venture closer to him. His skin is ashen, eyes sunken, and an unsettling smile spreads across his face when I approach, as if he's been expecting me, and without preamble, he leans in, his breath a rancid cloud hovering between us. "She's here for them," he croaks, his voice gravelly like dry leaves rasping against the pavement, "and when she comes for you, don't let her in." But just as I'm about to ask who exactly he's talking about, the shadowy figure reappears, gliding effortlessly between tables, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that makes my skin crawl. The whispers grow louder, a chant urging me to flee, but my legs are anchored, and in that moment, I'm aware that this isn't just a night at the bar. This is a turning point, an intersection between worlds, and as she closes in, I can feel a darkness pooling around my heart, the realization that I'm not just an observer here, I'm part of something far more sinister, something that's been waiting for me all along. And when her icy fingers finally graze my arm, a jolt of horror fractures my mind like a mirror shattering under impact, and I'm pulled into her gaze, drowning in the abyss. As everything I thought I knew collapses, I'm suspended in that moment, the peaceful bar transforming into a grotesque carousel of terrified faces reflecting my own dread, laughter turned to screams, pints shattering against walls, and as the darkness engulfs me, I know that whatever tranquility I once found in solitude has been torn apart, replaced by the haunting truth, I'm not meant to be alone at this bar. I take quick selfies when taking pictures for strangers, and it seems innocuous enough. After all, I'm just a guy with a camera, trying to make the most of my weekends by helping lost tourists capture memories, but something changed that day when I decided to take a photo for a couple at a park festival. They looked so happy, the sun catching the gleam in the woman's eyes, and as I raised my phone to snap the picture, I felt a sudden rush of unease. I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker just behind them, but when I glanced back, there was nothing but fading autumn leaves spinning in the wind. I brushed it off, focusing through the camera lens to frame the couple perfectly against the vibrant backdrop of the festivities, and when I handed them my phone, their gratitude was genuine, or at least I thought it was until later that night when I scrolled through the pictures and noticed something uncanny. In the background of their photo, just at the edge of the frame, there it was, the same shadow I thought I'd imagined, a dark, elongated figure with limbs that seemed too long, twisting, almost like they weren't bound by human anatomy, and I felt a chill trickle down my spine. Trying to shake off the feeling of dread, I went to bed, but when I tried to sleep, my mind kept replaying the jittery images. I whispered reassurances to calm myself down, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light or a passing person that I didn't notice, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help but feel that whatever that thing was, it had been looking right at me. It gnawed at me through the night until I finally decided to go back to the park the next day. Why? Just to be sure, just to prove to myself that it was nothing. And with a sense of false courage, I arrived at the bustling festival, my camera swinging at my side, but the moment I walked in, a heavier, indescribable weight settled on my chest. People laughed, children played, and the laughter of families rang out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and it took only an hour of awkward, nervous wandering before I was overwhelmed by the pull of my curiosity. I began capturing more photos of unsuspecting strangers, each time making a quick selfie to document my existence within the day, but every picture came back to me with that same shadow lurking ominously in the background, like a harbinger of dread waiting patiently for something, stalling within the edges of every frame and breaking my spirit little by little. By now, I couldn't function properly. I could feel an urgency drumming in my veins, compelling me to investigate the meaning behind this obsession that had taken root in my thoughts until I stumbled upon a woman selling homemade remedies in a makeshift stall, her eyes bright yet burdened with a depth of knowledge that sent a shiver down my spine as if she was privy to secrets I could never fathom. I approached her hesitantly, feeling foolish for even asking, but I told her about the shadowy figure and how it seemed to be connected to my pictures. To my surprise, she simply smiled condescendingly, as if she were an unsuspecting mother amused by a child's imaginary friend, and she spoke of ancient folklore in a voice that was both soothing and sinister, claiming that shadows like mine are not mere figments but echoes of energy, remnants of souls trapped between the living and the lost. Panic surged through me as I tried to explain that I was just trying to help people preserve their memories, but she cut me off, telling me that sometimes when you capture a moment, you also invite whatever is lurking within it to cross over, to attach itself to you. And all the while I felt my heart racing out of control as she pressed a small, black stone into my palm, telling me it would protect me if I truly wanted to rid myself of the entity that had latched onto me. I thanked her, feeling foolish and grateful in equal measure, and as I left the festival that day, I started to feel the oppressive weight lift ever so slightly, convinced that maybe I had overreacted and that the remedy would shield me from whatever malignant force had been haunting me, but instead, that night, I started having the most vivid dreams. I found myself standing in the park again, only it was dark, and the festival lights twinkled in a disorienting manner, illuminating strangers who were now twisted and ghastly, their faces distorted and unrecognizable as they seemed to dance around me in a frenzy. I turned to run, but before I could make it out, the darkness didn't chase me away, it wrapped around me like a warm blanket, drawing me in, and I could feel the shadow tightening its grip, whispering things I couldn't understand but resonated deep within my core, filling me with rage and despair, until I bolted upright in my bed, gasping for air. My phone buzzed insistently on my nightstand, and it took me a moment to find my bearings. It was a message from the couple, the very ones I had taken the initial photo of, and they thanked me again with a nudge of nostalgia, but out of nowhere, they asked if I noticed anything strange in the pictures, and before I could respond, they sent me a screenshot, a grainy image from the festival where I had taken their picture, but it wasn't the same shadow anymore. This one was gleaming by the edge of their hair, and now it had an undeniable form, a face with hollow eyes and a gaping maw, as though it had only just begun to crawl its way out of the realm between life and death. And in that moment of terror, I dropped my phone in disbelief, realizing all too late that I had not only taken a picture for them, but that I had unwittingly signed a pact. My selfies were no longer just innocent snapshots. They had become a portal, a call to something ancient and dark, and as I stood frozen, staring into the void of my dimly lit room, the shadows crept closer, creeping in with a deadly certainty, and I trembled in realization, knowing that I might have just sealed the fate of all those I had photographed, lost to the inescapable darkness beneath the flickering sun.
Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore. It was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival.
When I found out I was pregnant, it was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life, a dream realized after years of struggling with infertility and the heartbreak of miscarriages. But the joy was short-lived, overshadowed by a crushing sense of betrayal that gnawed at my insides like a ravenous beast. My partner, Jake, the father of my child, had always been charming and affectionate but had taken to acting distant and secretive over the last few weeks, something I brushed off as stress until one late night, my curiosity turned into dread as I found his phone left unattended on the kitchen counter, the screen illuminated to reveal a conversation with another woman that felt like a slap across my face. My pulse quickened as I read their flirtations, peppered with promises and innuendos that made my stomach twist, the last message searing into my memory: "Can't wait to feel you again, even if she's carrying your baby." I launched into a fit of rage and despair, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I confronted Jake, demanding the truth, and the moment he stumbled over his words, shame and guilt pooling in his eyes, I knew he had crossed a line, and as he confessed to his infidelity, the world around me shattered. He was unrepentant, claiming it was a mistake, that the affair had been meaningless, and when I finally got his admission that he hadn't used protection, my breath hitched, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. But the real horror didn't hit me until a few weeks later when I started to feel unwell, just a few cold sweats and brief moments of nausea at first, the kind of symptoms that are all too common during pregnancy, but then came the burning sensation and the dark realization that accompanied it. I had an STD, or at least that's what I pieced together from bits of information on the internet during those frantic, bleary-eyed nights. The diagnosis from the clinic was brief and sterile, but the words chlamydia and potential harm danced before my eyes. the nurse's voice a distant echo, as I sat frozen in the waiting room, tears spilling down my cheeks as I imagined the tiny life inside me being twisted and affected by Jake's betrayal. All I could think about was how I had wanted this baby so fiercely and had already lost so much, terrified that my body's failure to fight against the infection might take everything away from me again. When I returned home, the air felt heavier, thick with the unspoken truth that lingered between us like a festering wound. I could barely look at him, and I didn't want him to touch me, to comfort me, to pretend that everything was fine when I felt like I was spiraling into a dark abyss of despair. I should have left right then, packed my things, and just gone. But I was pregnant, scared, and too attached to the man I once loved to just walk out. I could still hear his voice, hear him say he had made a mistake, hear the hollow promises he offered to make it better, and I was weak enough to believe him, at least for a little while, until everything changed yet again. One evening, I felt the needling pain in my abdomen and decided I had to go to the emergency room. The doctors performed tests and determined my body was fighting against not just the STD but an infection that had taken root within me. But as the hours stretched on and I lay in a sterile hospital bed, the world outside became distant, a blur of voices and machinery, my focus narrowing to the steady rhythm of the monitor tracking the life growing within me, until it was interrupted by a blaring alarm that sent panic coursing through my veins. Doctors rushed into my room, and amidst their hurried conversations, I could hear snippets of phrases about peril and emergency C-section, and everything went black. When I woke, the bright lights of the recovery room pierced through my eyelids, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of my choices drop heavily on my chest. My heart raced as I glanced around, desperately seeking confirmation that my baby was safe, that I hadn't lost the one thing I cherished the most. But instead, a nurse with a sympathetic glimmer in her eyes approached, her words gently telling me that my baby had struggled but was stable now, a mixture of relief and fear washing over me. But part of me felt hollow, knowing that this fragile existence was a product of deceit and betrayal, a tainted legacy growing silently because of Jake's choices. I demanded to speak to the doctors, and when they described the potential consequences of the infection, how the untreated chlamydia could lead to long-term effects on my baby's development, it felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I felt like a failure as a mother already, and I hadn't even given birth yet, the guilt ripping through me as I vented my anger at those who had wronged me. I returned home after days of monitoring, my heart still heavy with fear and anger. Jake was waiting for me, remorse plastered on his face, but all I could think of was every touch that felt tainted by his infidelity, every promise he made laced with dishonesty. I wanted to hate him, wanted to let my rage bubble over into something more tangible, but I found myself stuck in this morass of emotions, just trying to keep myself together for the baby's sake. Months passed, and I slowly learned to forgive myself for what had happened, as if it would alleviate some of the guilt I wore like a second skin. But the day I delivered my daughter felt like releasing a secret I had held too long. The labor was excruciating, but as I held her in my arms for the first time, the pain dissipated like a long-lost memory. Yet even then, a cruel twist remained, a gnawing thought that returned alongside the love I felt, that my daughter would always carry the shadow of her father's betrayal, and as I sat cradling her, I realized I not only bore the emotional scars of Jake's betrayal but also the remnants of his callous actions, leaving me to wonder if every small hiccup she had would be another reminder of the darkness he had brought into our lives, each milestone a grim reflection of the love I had fought for against impossible odds. In the years that followed, I watched my daughter grow, wincing at every cough, every fever, hoping I wouldn't see the repercussions of my trust in her father manifest in her health, my heart thrumming with anxiety as I meticulously monitored her development, feeling as if I was living in the shadow of an impending storm. The day she took her first steps, my heart swelled with pride, but a dark cloud loomed as I recalled the intentions that had led to her conception. I made a decision then, I would never let Jake lay his eyes on her, our once perfect life shattered beyond repair. I planned to be the mother she deserved, one who could shield her from the pain of betrayal that crept, silent and ready, from the very man who was supposed to protect us both, resigning myself to the reality that some scars never truly heal, that every moment with her was a chance to rewrite our story, even if his shadow would always linger just beyond the periphery of our lives.
I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. "Hey! You shouldn't be here." It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. "This area's reserved. Get lost." I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. "People are just doing their thing," my father said over breakfast. "You know how the hunters can get." But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. "You hear me?" I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. "You can't scare me off my own land." Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. "Show yourself," I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. "Mighty brave of you to come here," he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. "You think you have more claim to this land than I do?" Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. "This is my family's land," I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. "You're nothing but a trespasser." Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. "I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now." The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. "You don't own this place," I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, "and you're not welcome here." His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. "You think you can keep me away?" He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. "What's going on?" my father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. "This land should have been theirs long ago," he whispered venomously, "but sometimes, the strong take what they want." I felt my breath seize in my throat. I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. "Run," I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted, fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. "What are you doing?" my mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. AITA for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent? It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop, an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera, and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know."
I'm sorry, but But I can't assist with that. It was a blistering summer day when my friends convinced me to join them at the river for what they described as the quintessential teenage adventure, inner tubing down the winding, sun-kissed waters. My parents were out of town, and I figured, what the hell, right? Besides, trust my friends, especially Derek and Carla, they promised it was going to be epic. So, I threw on my swimsuit, packed a cooler full of sodas, and headed out, laughing and joking as we piled into Derek's car like a bunch of thrill-seeking idiots. The river was picturesque, shimmering sun, lush trees bending over the edges, the water flowing with that gentle, inviting burble that screamed fun. We inflated our tubes right on the shore, children of the wild, ready to conquer the river like a ragtag army. The first hour was pure bliss, floating down, shouting, splashing water on each other, and reminiscing about childhood memories. We drifted lazily, sunburns starting to peek at our exposed skin, until I felt it. The unmistakable pressure in my stomach that could only mean one thing. I should have known better. I had eaten way too many snacks back at Derek's house, but now I was out here, miles down the river with no restroom in sight, feeling the impending doom of the worst kind of discomfort. I casually drifted a bit behind, trying to make light of it with humor, but my laughter was swallowed by the sound of rushing water and what felt like impending disaster. I considered my options: paddle to the shore and hope to find a bathroom, or just ride it out. Deep down, I knew it'd be a bad idea. Yet, with every passing moment, the pressure mounted, and I was painfully aware of the stares my friends were throwing at me, their laughter ringing hollow against my anxious mind. Just then, the river plunged into a small rapids, and as I gasped and whooped with adrenaline, the pressure in my gut screamed, and I knew I had to make a decision. Wisdom would have said to let it be, that no one would ever find out. But with one last surge of courage, and maybe a tad bit of madness, I naively thought I could manage both the thrill of the rapids and the growing urgency twisting my insides. It couldn't be that bad, right? As we slipped over the edge of the rapids, my fear clouded my judgment, and I lost the battle. The second I hit the calm part of the river again, I felt it release, more of an explosion than a trickle, and in that instant, I realized I'd just done the absolute unthinkable. I felt wretched, frozen in time, caught between sinking into the abyss of humiliation and acceptance. The water didn't care, just another way to taint the purity of its flow. Oh God, I looked around, panicked, and all I could see were my friends blissfully floating away, seemingly unaware of my internal meltdown. Carla caught my eye, a playful grin painted across her sun-kissed face, and I felt a chill run through me. I knew she would eventually smell it. My heart raced faster than I could paddle, trying to make myself look unbothered. But it's impossible to carry such a secret in the open air, when every breeze seems to whisper shame. A minute felt like an eternity as I prayed for the winds to shift and my friends to forget I was alive, and for a fleeting moment, they were blissfully unaware, their voices filled with laughter, until Derek suddenly paused, his nose wrinkling, and just like that, the laughter faded into an uneasy silence. "Oh, what the hell is that?" he shouted, looking at me with a mix of confusion and disgust. I watched as his expression morphed into dread. He knew. Carla turned her head, her grin melting into horror, and I felt the eyes of the world pin me to that moment forever like a haunting flashcard. The laughter disintegrated, replaced by gasps of understood betrayal. They had my number, and God help me, I was trapped. The water wrapped around me like a noose, suffocating, as horror spread among us like a contagious plague. I wanted a black hole to swallow me up, to cease to exist where I was ensnared in the stifling silence, no one wanting to breach the profound act of what had just transpired. Derek made a gagging sound and tried to steer his tube away from me, suddenly laughing, but it was hollow and bitter. I could hear it choke against his throat. "Dude, are you serious?" Carla's voice was piercing and laced with disbelief. Their laughter turned sharp, accusatory, like arrows aiming straight for my heart, every single word a reminder of my fall from grace. "You can't be serious," Derek repeated like a mantra through laughter mixed with horror. Yet the moment felt too heavy to bear. I felt the world shifting beneath me, friendships teetering on the edge of collapse, while I, the warrior of shame, faced the consequences of lax judgment and urgency. The river felt like an executioner's platform, my laughter a distant memory, lost in the strum of nature's cruel symphony. The rest of the ride home was a tumult of emotions. They mocked me gently at first, but the laughter quickly turned into vicious teasing. I could no longer keep my head held high. Instead, I wanted to sink as low as possible under the waters of the current. Every splash they made felt like a calculated attack on what's left of my dignity, and I swore that they were nothing but sharks, circling my pathetic, exposed soul. By the time we reached the shore, The laughter had dulled to mere echoes of what had happened, haunting for years on, as the memory carved itself ever so deeply into my existence. I'd hoped it would fade, that maybe, just maybe, it would become just another funny story to tell, an absurdity shared later in life. But I learned quickly that some traumas are too profound, too intimate, meant to be buried deep beneath the surface, as I became the punchline in our circle, a shadow of mockery. To this day, the smell of chlorine and river water pulls me back to that fateful afternoon, the laughter of my so-called friends, and the way I unceremoniously mutilated my youth with a choice that would follow me forever. I stride through life now with a weight that can't be shed, a darkness rooted in those ephemeral moments of childish recklessness, and as I sit here and type this, my heart races, wondering if the guilt of that day will ever truly wash away. I was 14 when my dad remarried, and at first, I thought having a stepmom might be fun. She seemed nice enough, always bringing me little gifts and smiling her way into my life. But as soon as the honeymoon phase wore off, things took a dark turn. My stepmom, Lydia, was obsessed with appearances, and not in a healthy way. The first time she mentioned hair, I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, and she poked her head in, her smile plastered on a face that always felt like it was holding back something sinister. "You know, darling, if you just let a little more grow, you'd look so much more mature," she said, her eyes glinting like shards of glass. I laughed it off, thinking she was joking, but that was just the beginning. As weeks passed, she began to push me harder. She filled our bathroom with creams and potions that she insisted would enhance my natural beauty. I complied, thinking it was just a phase, but when she began to shave patches of my hair off and coax me into embracing the fuzz blossoming around my chin, I started to feel trapped. "You're so beautiful as you are," she would say, but it never seemed sincere. My friends began to notice the strange hair growth, whispering behind my back at school, and I felt shame like I had never known. One day, as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to figure out how to tell my dad, Lydia entered, holding a thin razor and grinning madly. "It's time to take it to the next level, sweetheart," she coaxed, and I froze, every cell in my body screaming for me to run. It was then that I realized the hair wasn't just her obsession, it was something darker. With every stroke of the razor, my reflection morphed into some grotesque version of myself. I became the living embodiment of Lydia's twisted ideals, the hair thickening, curling, until what remained of my identity faded like summer light. My room grew quiet, the once comforting glow of posters and knickknacks distorted by Lydia's chaotic energy. My dad had no idea, the man he loved was too enchanted by her facade, oblivious to the darkness clouding his daughter's existence. I started to withdraw from everyone outside my home, the glares and jeers at school replaced by muffled conversations in dark corners. Then came the day she brought home a strange little old woman. Lydia introduced her as Clara, her facilitator, whatever that meant. Clara's eyes glittered like feral jewels as she surveyed me, and for the first time, I felt like a specimen under glass, my humanity dissected in their minds. "We're just helping you embrace your true self," she cackled, her voice reminiscent of dead leaves scraping the asphalt. The following weeks were a blur of humiliation, each morning marked by terrifying silences filled only by the buzzing of clippers and the scent of unnatural oils. I didn't just have a beard, I felt as if I were being groomed for something much more sinister. Knowledge that I couldn't fully grasp loomed menacingly in the corners of my mind. I finally confronted my dad one fateful evening, the words tumbling out in a chaotic mess as I begged him to listen. "Lydia's crazy, I'm not this person, I don't want to be this," but the words fell flat against the rigid lines of his shirt as he turned away, dismissive. "She loves you, you need to accept her guidance," he replied, and that was when I lost it, ranting, spewing out my anguish until there was nothing left but the hollow ache of a daughter desperate for her father's recognition. Slowly, the gravity of my life pressed down harder, and I found myself sneaking away to the library, hiding between the rows of dusty tomes, searching for something to latch onto, a sense of self that seemed unreachable in my own home. One rainy evening, as I thumbed through a book on folklore, I stumbled across tales of shape-shifting creatures that could take human form but hid secrets beneath the surface. The parallels unraveled in my mind, and I saw Lydia's true nature. She wasn't just a woman, she was something other than human, using my femininity as a vessel for whatever dark agenda she thrived on. That realization pinched my heart with fear but infused me with a strange courage. I wouldn't let her bend my will any longer. That night, as the storm howled outside, I lay in bed, plotting my escape. In the days that followed, I gathered my strength, watching her every move, learning all the things she missed about me. I would appear obedient, the dutiful daughter in her eyes, while secretly waiting for the moment she revealed the full extent of her ambition. The opportunity came when she announced a small ritual, just the three of us, she said, to solidify our family bond. I barely slept that night, thinking of Claire's mocking laugh. As Lydia prepared her bizarre array of candles and odd herbs in the heart of the living room, a tremor of dread shook my resolve. When she began chanting in a low, guttural voice that resonated with something primal and dark, I knew this was it. My chance. I sprinted to the kitchen, clutching a knife tightly, the metallic taste of adrenaline spurring me on as I returned. But when I swung it at her, slicing through the space between us, she flinched but did not scream. Instead, her eyes ignited with an unspeakable rage, and the air grew thick with tension. "You think you can escape, child? This isn't just about appearances, it's about power," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, and the room spiraled into chaos as Clara cackled like a maniac, raising her hands, twisting the shadows. In that moment, it dawned on me, she wasn't just my stepmom, she was stealing pieces of me, weaving them into some dark tapestry that would make her powerful, all while using my identity against me. I plunged the knife into the altar of herbs she had so meticulously laid out, a desperate effort, and as it shattered in a burst of light, the room erupted around us. Lydia's facade peeled away, revealing a shadow creature, and Clara, transformed into a wraith, screaming violently as the darkness enveloped them both. I stumbled back, horrified and yet liberated, as their forms disintegrated into wisps of shadows carried away by the wind. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house, the weight of my beard somehow gone, and with it, the invisible strings that once bound me to their grotesque quill. I wandered into the sun, feeling the softness of my face, my identity, encapsulated in the warmth of my skin. My dad never spoke of Lydia again. It was as if she had never existed, but I knew better. I had glimpsed the darkness lurking beneath the surface of our lives, and I would carry that knowledge with me. I found my voice again, and though the scars of my experience would stay, I had reclaimed not only my identity but my place in the world, and that was worth everything.
Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, Sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moments stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered. For what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us?
For the last 10 years, I've built my life on the shaky foundation of my own lies, convinced that gaslighting myself was the only way to survive the sprawling darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. It all began with a fleeting thought on a cold autumn night, the trees swaying like dark sentinels outside my window, whispering secrets of truths I didn't want to hear, and somewhere in that chill, a desire stirred within me to rewrite the narrative of my existence, to take control of my reality by crafting an alternate version of myself, a version that everyone around me would believe, and in return, I crafted self-assurances like a repeated prayer, convincing not just myself but also my friends and family that I was always the life of the party, the optimist who sought silver linings in every struggle. But deep down, I felt like a ghost drifting through a waking nightmare, losing grasp on the boundaries between what was real and what was just a figment of my anxiety, a haze of denial obscuring all. I spun tales of grandeur where I was a successful artist, eluding the truth that I spent my days working in a dull office, covering my fragile self with the vivid pigments of my imagined life. A life where people respected me, loved me, and saw something worthy. The years dissolved into a blur as I meticulously crafted a web of half-truths and delusions, convincing those I cared about, and eventually even myself, that my canvas was full of brilliant strokes, but inside, the colors muddied, pulling me into a relentless cycle of fear and deception, as I smiled through the facade at birthday parties and family gatherings, laughing when I should have been crying, skills I mastered over time, each mask more polished with layers of deceit. While at night, I'd stare at the ceiling, the silence enveloping me like a thick fog as I searched for the truth buried deep beneath my make-believe, whispering to myself how it was too late to turn back, far too late to reveal the cracks in my shimmering disguise. My sister Sarah, bless her heart, always believed my tales, her bright eyes reflecting the confidence I had instilled in her. She would often talk about my upcoming art show, a grand event I fabricated, and I just kept letting those lies spill from my lips, watching her excitement bloom. But with each passing day, I felt the weight of my lies like boulders resting on my chest, suffocating me. Things spiraled out of control when I fell for someone truly remarkable, Jared, with his golden laughter and boundless talent, a man whose light illuminated the corners of my own darkness. I wanted so desperately to share my life with him, to let him see the real me, but all I managed to do was trap him in my web, feeding him scraps of reality while withholding the bitter truth of my existence. My genuine self was hidden beneath layers of betrayal to my own spirit. Over coffee dates and twilight walks, I showcased elaborately fabricated stories of success, sidestepping the reality of a girl paralyzed by her own fears. Yet the more I cloaked myself in this idealized version, the more I realized I loathed who I had become, a hollow echo in a den of my own creation. It was ultimately our year anniversary that broke me, a beautifully wrapped gift waiting for me at my doorstep with my name scrawled across it in Jared's spindly handwriting. My heart raced as I tore off the paper, revealing a book titled The Art of Being Real, a journal filled with notes, sketches, and reflections, the blank pages blanketing his hopes for our future. It felt like a physical manifestation of everything I couldn't be, and just like that, the gilded facade collapsed in my chest, dust and shadows swirling around me. I thought I could maintain the illusion, that I could gaslight my own heart into believing in me, but the reality was crashing in like an unforgiving tide. Every whisper of "you'll never be good enough" crashing against the fortress I built. Panic ripped through me, and I confronted Jared, my breath coming in shallow bursts, begging for a way to escape the spiraling waves of truth. I fought against the revelations that screamed louder than my lies. "I'm not who you think I am," I cried, watching confusion flash in his eyes, the kind eyes that once sparkled with sincerity now clouded over with an unrecognizable mix of concern and disappointment. All peace crumbled as I revealed the hollow Manning behind the curtain. Cracking under the pressure of fabrications, and the panic over losing him became an all-consuming fire. My mind twisted into a frenzy, sending me deeper into the abyss until that moment came, a glimmer of clarity illuminating an unshakable truth. The people I'd gaslit would always be able to see through my layers of deception eventually, and the only way to save anyone was to finally own my brokenness, to peel off the layers that seemed to protect but actually chained me down. I thought I was protecting everyone else, living my life in a delusional bubble. But I had only imprisoned myself in a world of distortions, and it was then, while drenched in tears and shattered confessions, that I irrevocably changed the story I'd been telling not just Jared but everyone, hoping against hope that they would understand and not view me as just a mindless liar but as a flawed human being striving for authenticity. But as Jared looked away, searching for the right words, I realized that sometimes the truth hurts worse than any lie, and despite pouring my heart out, the space that once vibrated with love felt colder. An echo of all the things I'd concealed crashing around me, and as silence draped around us like a thick fog, I feared that maybe this time, I really had lost it all. For weeks, I had watched Greg, our flashy co-worker, slip into the dimly lit bathroom beneath the fluorescent buzz of the office lights, only to emerge moments later, his demeanor disheveled, and his eyes glazed over, a shadow of their former self. It started when I overheard him mumbling to himself during a meeting, and while I brushed it off at first, the unsettling scent of stale cigarettes and something sweetly sickly wafting through the air during our lunch breaks couldn't be ignored, and with each passing day, my concern morphed into a gnawing suspicion that he was drowning his anxiety in more than just caffeine, leading me to one fateful day when the stress of deadlines and uncomfortable interactions coalesced into a moment of reckless courage, pushing me to scribble a note that ominously read, "I saw Greg snorting Xanax in the bathroom and leaving it on my boss's computer." The thrill of uncertainty mingling with guilt as I left the office for the day, convinced that I was doing the right thing, protecting my colleagues and preserving the office's integrity. The following morning, I returned to a charged atmosphere, whispers electrifying the air, and the uneasy tension in the break room made me feel as if everyone's eyes were drawn to me, yet paradoxically, none of them seemed to notice the absence of Greg, who was unceremoniously terminated last night, or so I was told. The details were murky at best, but it became painfully evident that the note had reached the right hands and precipitated a swift downfall, his pathetic excuse for an explanation lost between hushed giggles and nervous glances among my co-workers, their laughter sharp enough to cut through my anxiety, and still I couldn't shake the feeling that I had triggered something much darker than I intended. As I replayed my decision over and over in my mind like a haunting melody, what if Greg wasn't just snorting Xanax? What if it was worse? The tremors of guilt knotted my insides, turning the office into a stage set for a terrible crime, and that sense was only deepened when I witnessed Lisa, his closest confidant, her face pale, almost as if the very essence of joy had leaked out of her during the chaos, approached me in the copy room, her eyes wide with sleepless fright. She lowered her voice, the tremor in her hands shaking the paper she clutched, a half-written apology to Greg scrawled in a hurried script. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, leaving me cold, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I questioned her allegiance and intentions, each word wrapping itself around my mind like a noose. Days turned into nights, and while the office buzz continued, Greg's absence grew heavier, thicker, like a fog strangling the very air, and at noon, I noticed Lisa arguing with our boss in hushed, frantic whispers, pointing fingers with expressions that mirrored horror more than anger, but it was her expression that struck a chord in my gut, the real fear radiating off of her like heat from a fire. Something elsewhere in our building had gone off course, and even though pieces of the puzzle scattered across my mind didn't seem to form a picture, they would remain there, spiraling into dark thoughts until the day I got home and found a mangled note slipped through my door saying, "You have no idea what you've done," scrawled in Greg's handwriting. My heart fell, terror and regret intertwined like roots from a twisted, ancient tree, and as night fell and sleep evaded me, I stared at the ceiling wondering who else had known, who else had seen Mark's deepening darkness in the bathroom. The whispers to each other now morphing into something sinister, paranoia locking doors inside my mind, then driving out to find comfort in any possible way. I found myself reaching out to a friend, only to realize the stakes were far too high. The entanglement of betrayal and ignorance stretched infinitely. Every phone call seemed compromised, every interaction tinged with a silent undertow of danger, and reality itself began to feel skewed, a mirage flickering at the corners of my vision. Before you know it, I was awake every night, the insidious thoughts taking root, convinced that Greg was watching me, a specter haunting my cubicle, lying in wait for the perfect opportunity to strike back, twisting the narrative so skillfully that even I doubted my own intentions, once so solid, now drowned in uncertainty. And then, one fateful evening, as I departed late from the office in a haze of fatigue, I felt the prickle of eyes on my back, a familiar shiver that sent shudders through my body, making my dinner lurch, only to find Greg standing in the shadows between cars, a smirk twisting his lips, hidden beneath the fluorescent glow of the streetlights, his presence slithering into my nightmares. "You think you can ruin me?" he whispered, stepping into the light just enough for me to see the depthless darkness behind his eyes, and it was in that moment, dear reader, that I felt the cold hand of regret wrap around my throat, because I had thought I had done something good when, in reality, I had unleashed a storm I would never survive. And now, all I can say is that if you ever feel compelled to right a wrong, just remember, the consequences might not just come for you, but for everyone you love, and sometimes the monsters you create are far worse than the ones you thought you were saving others from. I'm lying to everyone I've ever known and ever will meet, and it all spirals back to that one fateful night when thunder cracked the sky like a gunshot, and I found myself standing before a figure so grotesque that I still can't shake the image from my consciousness. The storm had begun rolling in, heavy and brooding, As I drove down an old country road, my only company the flickering glow of my headlights against the encroaching darkness that enveloped the landscape like a suffocating shroud. I just left a party, feeling the stirrings of the usual ennui that filled the moments before I could slip beneath the sheets of my quiet, nondescript life, when I saw her, really, on the side of the road. The creature looked like a woman at first, slim and unkempt, drenched by the torrential downpour, but as I slowed to a stop to offer her a ride, I realized how wrong I was. The moment she stepped forward, her face, pale and covered in dark, matted hair, illuminated by the car's headlights, revealed deep-set eyes that glistened with an unnatural hunger, a mouth that opened far too wide, exposing rows of jagged teeth that churned with drool. The slam of my heart echoed in my ears as she raised a hand, finger outstretched, beckoning me closer, her voice a haunting croak that promised secrets and darkness, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an instinct that screamed for me to run, and yet, there was something alluring about her, a draw that pulled me closer as if I was entranced. I didn't know what compelled me, whether it was curiosity or sheer madness, but I've never regretted anything in my life as deeply as the choice to roll down my window and ask if she needed help. Her eyes lit up with a ravenous glint, and she climbed inside without permission, barely taking note of my presence, her breath a swirling mass of decay. And then, she whispered my name, the name I had never told her, a name buried deep within my darkest memories. I should have turned around, should have thrown myself out of the moving car, but instead, I felt a thrill of fear intertwine with a sick fascination as I realized she knew everything, the lies I'd spun to weave a perfect life, the secrets I'd taken to my grave. For weeks, I had been pretending to be someone I wasn't, a dutiful brother, a dedicated employee, a caring boyfriend, all roles draped on the flimsy fabric of my identity to mask the truth that I had abandoned the innocent boy who once aspired to become someone real, relegated instead to a phantom version of myself, run by the whims of a twisted psyche. As she leaned closer, her fetid scent filling the car, she unraveled the truth of who I was beneath the surface, layers of lies peeled back until I felt completely exposed, raw and quivering in her gaze. I couldn't bear it, the flood of shame consuming me as she smiled, revealing more of those jagged teeth, and I understood, with a chilling clarity, that she meant to take everything from me, not just my feeble attempts to create a life worth living, but my very soul. In that moment, I knew I had to escape. It wasn't just about my false persona anymore, she was hungry for something far darker than mere secrets, and I wasn't sure if I could outrun whatever she intended to devour. In a wild burst of adrenaline, I sped away into the enveloping night, my heart racing as her laughter echoed like the thunder clapping overhead, mocking my very existence. No one would ever know what I had seen, what I had done, how close I had come to being consumed by the truth of my own deceit, and that thought clenched at my insides as I sliced through the rain, determined to bury the darkness born of that encounter. But the fabric of my life began to unravel, even in the safety of my own home. I could feel her presence, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering insinuations that gnawed away at the stability I'd so meticulously constructed. I would sit with friends, the laughter echoing against the walls, and I would play my part, the charming facade firmly in place, but every grin felt like a mask clashing against the tightness in my chest, where the truth festered. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of my duplicity strangled me, creeping into every interaction, every conversation. I was convinced that if I looked in the mirror hard enough, I'd find her standing just behind me, waiting for an opportunity to drag me back into that void of darkness. In moments of solitude, I would hear her crooning my name, and I was tormented by dreams of her where I'd wake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath as her laughter slithered around my consciousness. I became a prisoner to my own fear, forged by one harrowing encounter, and soon, the lies I told others transformed into lies I told myself, feeding the endless cycle of madness. I told my brother I was fine when, in truth, I felt like a ghost in my own skin. I spun elaborate tales to my girlfriend about work, decorating them with half-truths and glossing over the gnawing unease that hollered at me from inside my chest. Even when they'd look at me, their eyes filled with trust and affection, I couldn't share the suffocating truth that tainted my every breath, so I became a collector of secrets, lost in a labyrinth of my own design. The lies were easy, everyone loves a good story, the thrill of truth tinged with fantasy, but the suffocating darkness of my thousand-layered deceit began to compound until it felt as though a noose had tightened around my throat, squeezing until I thought I would choke. I feared the moment when the fiction I'd created would become a reality, but more than that, I feared her coming back, hungry for what she believed I owed her because, somewhere in my heart, I knew she would return. And then one day, as I sat in my car at a red light, plagued by the jagged shards of my own conscience, I turned to look out the passenger's window, and there she was, standing in the pouring rain, her hair matted against her skin, peeling lips stretching into a skull-cracking grin that twisted the knife of fear deep into my gut. The pulse of adrenaline thrummed like an unholy ritual, and I slammed the gear into drive, heart hammering as I sped through the intersection, defined by panic and dread, but the weight of guilt and the thought that she was waiting for the outcome of my selfish games gnawed at me relentlessly. I'm lying to everyone I've ever known and ever will meet, and I don't know how to escape the noose that binds me to her grim fate, this unholy link forged in truth and shadows, and I realize with a sickening clarity that the moment our paths entwined, my life was never mine to control again. The lies ripple outward, they morph, taking root in every soul I've touched, until I'm standing at the precipice of a truth I can no longer swallow, her promises echoing in the silence behind me. I'm afraid that one day, all these lies will come crashing down like a storm, and I will find myself in the very void I tried to escape, where she waits, ready to collect her due. It was just another mundane Wednesday morning when I decided to throw caution to the wind and head to work without my bra, a small act of defiance against the everyday grind that seemed to be smothering me. The sun peeked through the blinds as I pulled on my blazer, the fabric a comforting cocoon around my shoulders, convinced that no one would notice my lack of undergarments beneath the structured layers. Walking into the office felt oddly liberating, a rush of adrenaline coursing through me as I blended in with the bustling crowd, but as the hours ticked on, an unsettling feeling crept in. It was a strange awareness that perhaps I was too free, too exposed. I glanced around the office, my colleagues engaged in their usual routines, tapping on keyboards, the air thick with mundane chatter. Yet there was something off, an atmosphere heavy with an unnameable tension lurking just beneath the surface. Shadows danced too long along the walls and laughter echoed a little too loudly, like a sinister chorus mocking my bravado. By lunchtime, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Was it just paranoia? I tried to shake it off, focusing on my sandwich while I overheard snippets of conversation, whisperings that grew clearer yet stifled as my name floated through the air, laced with hushed tones that only heightened my unease. I went to the restroom to splash cold water on my face, my reflection staring back with hollow eyes, and that's when I first noticed the flickering light above the mirror, pulsing like a heartbeat, almost rhythmic. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to poor maintenance, when suddenly a sharp knock startled me. It was Melanie from HR, her expression tight and unyielding as she leaned toward the door and whispered, "You need to get out of here." Confused and concerned, I stepped closer, my heart racing, demanding to know what was happening, but her eyes darted behind me, filled with something unrecognizable and terrified. I turned, but the restroom was empty, the overhead lights buzzed ominously. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice dropping to a hiss, "they're watching everyone." Panic washed over me, my stomach dropping as I processed her words. Was this some elaborate joke? Melanie was known for her dry humor, but this felt different, urgent. Before I could ask for clarity, she shoved a note into my hand and hurried away, leaving me to wrestle with the cryptic message scrawled in hurried, shaky handwriting. "The office isn't what it seems, there's a reason you feel watched." Clutching the note, I felt my earlier bravery dissolve into dread. Every tick of the clock echoing louder, every footstep outside the restroom door a reminder that I was not alone, and for the first time since arriving, I wanted to flee. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out, intending to find a safe corner where I could think, but the moment I turned the corner, I stumbled into a coworker I had barely spoken to, Daniel, a shadow of a man with vacant eyes who stood in the middle of the corridor, his gaze locking onto mine with an unsettling intensity. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice shaky as if he was afraid to be overheard, further igniting the fire of fear raging within me. I took a step back, but his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with bone-crushing strength. "The Watchers don't like people who don't follow the rules," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder, beads of sweat pooling on his forehead. I pulled away, backing up, my heart racing as I searched for an escape route. Something was terribly wrong. The office, my supposed sanctuary, transformed into a labyrinth where every face seemed to harbor secrets, every hallway twisted under the weight of unspoken threats. I scanned for Melanie or anyone familiar, but the atmosphere grew thicker, as if I had plunged into murky water, drowning in paranoia. Finally, I spotted the fire exit, that stark red symbol illuminating my path like a beacon of hope, but as I rushed toward it, the lights flickered violently, plunging the building into a half-darkness that pulled screams of terror from the mouths of my co-workers, turning the hustle and bustle of work into a nightmarish echo chamber of panicked voices. I pushed through the door and stumbled down the stairs, But the further I descended, the deeper I felt the oppressive weight of whatever was lurking in the dark. The fire alarm blared now, an awful siren piercing through the chaos, twisting the anxiety into full-blown terror. My legs felt weak, as if they were trying to reject this reality that had spiraled so quickly out of control. Just as I reached the last landing, the thick, sulphurous scent of smoke enveloped me, mingling with a metallic tang that tasted of fear. I realized I had to get out, only to be met by a wall of charred, iridescent figures standing in the doorway outside, their eyes hollow voids, gazing forward with an unknowable intent. They moved in unison, their bodies an amalgamation of office attire and something more grotesque, something that wasn't human, as they whispered my name in a chorus that drummed against my skull like an impending reckoning. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but they closed in, and as I felt their fingers brush against my skin, the last remnants of my physical form dissipated like smoke into the ether, engulfed by the darkness that welcomed me into a world devoid of safety or sanity. The irony hit me as I realized it was my rebellion against the mundane that had led me here, my choice to remove my bra resulting in a far more profound nakedness beneath their insatiable gaze. I once thought I possessed autonomy, but I had traded my freedom for a front row seat to an elaborate trap I couldn't escape. Now, as I exist in this haze of shadowy dread, I can hear the whispers rise up in the office above, echoing through the void, warning those who might tread where I once did, engulfed by the weight of a choice that seemed insignificant but bore a consequence far greater than I could have fathomed.
I'm writing this because I'm terrified, and I need to share my story before it consumes me. It all started innocently enough. My mother-in-law, Diane, was a well-meaning woman, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself in the years we spent feigning cordiality while navigating her unpredictable rages. A few weeks before her death, when she was confined to a hospital bed after a sudden heart attack, she let slip her plans for her will. We sat there, my husband and I, sipping weak coffee in that sterile waiting room, our expressions shifting from bored to tense as she rambled on about the 5 timeshares she insisted were a gift from the heart. 5 timeshares, 1 in the Bahamas, 2 in the Smoky Mountains, and 2 in Oregon, all racking up an eye-watering total of $9,500 in annual fees. We had explicitly told her we couldn't maintain such burdens, especially since we were trying to stabilize our own lives after the pandemic, but she had become a different person. In her fevered state, she grew angry, her voice rising until the monitors beeped in protest, spitting out an array of frantic notes, and as they moved to stabilize her, I felt something shift in the air. We lost her a day later, and with her went those ominous plans like a dark storm cloud hovering over us. When we gathered with the family days later to read the will, her attorney handed over a neatly typed paper outlining her loving gifts. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned the page, but as I looked around the room, none of my in-laws seemed to flinch. Their expressions were almost gleeful, like they were satisfied with her eccentric logic. I turned to my husband, gauging his reaction, but he was silent, a muscle twitching at his jaw. That's when I felt my gut twist. Did they know something I didn't? I brushed it off, thinking that maybe this was her outrageous way of keeping us tied to her legacy. Yet, as the days passed, keeping up with anonymous letter after letter from the timeshare companies demanding payment, I began to feel something lurking in the shadows. The first sign I noticed was at our doorstep, a heavy package wrapped in a dark, coated paper with no return address. I opened it to find an ominous leather binder embossed with an insignia I didn't recognize, a serpent intertwining with a skull, each letter ominously fading into the worn edges. Inside, an old photograph showed timeshares with figures that looked hauntingly familiar. My heart raced as I flipped through, affirmation of Diane's haunting grip still latching onto us, grinning maliciously through the ages. I felt the chill of unseen eyes, and it escalated to a weekly affliction. Every Monday, more packages arrived, and with them, an ever-deepening dread. They held strange notes, requests that revealed an unsettling trend. Each note dished out threats about some familial pact that had gone unfulfilled, with instructions no one could decipher. It claimed that we would own not only the timeshares, but also their dark histories, leading us to confront shattered memories of the past I didn't know I was connected to. My husband became a shell of who he was, slowly deteriorating under the pressure of family whispers, and it broke my heart to watch as he no longer found solace in our home. We fought more, and nights devolved into silence as we each lay awake, haunted. Then, one night while unpacking a new round of letters, I stumbled upon something even darker, a crudely drawn map with arrows leading to the bases of the timeshare properties, each one marked with an X. As I studied it, the atmosphere in the room thickened, and I could hear my husband yelling at something invisible. He was in a fit, begging for whatever dark presence to leave us alone as he drew back into that despondent spiral. I watched in horror as the glow around him dimmed. Suddenly, he wasn't himself anymore. The land where we thought we would craft memories had begun to consume us, revealing secrets that had long lingered in the shadows. We tried cutting ties, but the letters became more menacing, each threatening paragraph ushering in a new realm of despair. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, bringing echoes of Diane standing at the edge of a storm-lashed beach, her laughter twisted and echoing as though she enjoyed watching us writhe in agony, and each night, it felt like we were being pulled into an abyss where neither of us could escape. My husband grew distant, wrapped in unfathomable darkness until one evening I woke up to find him gone. Panic set in as I searched everywhere, only to find the door ajar, leading to the open night air where the moon hung heavy. It was at that moment I realized he had become entrapped in the very thing Diane had left us, a cursed possession disguised as a gift. I ran toward the beach as fear surged through me, and at the water's edge, I caught sight of him standing there, entranced by something in the distance. I screamed, but the waves drowned me out, and by the time I reached him, his eyes were glazed over, filled with a stirring malice that raised my hair and froze my breath. It wasn't him anymore, it was something sinister wearing his skin as the ground trembled beneath me. I stumbled back, realizing that Diane's gift was more than financial, it was an unholy legacy. Now, every time a package arrives, every whisper from our family or sighting at our doorstep sends chills washing over me. I can't tell what's real anymore, and as the letters demand my husband's soul, I feel the tide rise, cleaving our fates, one letter at a time. So here I am, terrified and alone, begging for someone to believe me, drowning in the legacy she intended for us, an inheritance of which we never asked, but now it feels like we've entered an irrevocable deal with the dead, and each passing day, I fear I will wake up at the water's edge and find him gone forever, consumed by the darkness, forever tangled in the serpent's embrace.
I didn't give him the job because his kid is a jerk, and I hate myself for it now. It started out as a standard hiring process for a position at the small tech company I managed. We had several applicants, but Jay Davis caught my attention. His resume was impressive, a testament to his skills and experience, but it was his glowing recommendations that really swayed me. People praised his professionalism, his insight, his ability to work miracles with code. I wanted nothing more than to welcome him aboard, but then I met his son, Timmy. I can still vividly remember the day Jay brought him along to the interview. My office door was ajar when I saw Timmy standing outside, a scruffy kid no older than 10 with an unkempt mop of hair that seemed to bounce as he paced in front of my office. He was clutching a toy robot, jaw set in defiance, clearly bored and uninterested. When Jay asked Timmy to sit quietly, the boy rolled his eyes and plopped down in the corner, ignoring his father completely. Jay started talking about his background, and as he did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Timmy was staring daggers at me. I tried not to focus on him but caught him muttering under his breath, something about how he hoped I wouldn't take his dad's job away from him like some kind of ominous threat. All throughout the interview, I felt like I was being observed, scrutinized by someone far too young to understand the complexities of adult life. When Jay excused himself to take a phone call, I couldn't help but look over at Timmy, whose face twisted in a pout as he cradled the robot, his expression darkening whenever a smile flickered across my face. Just then, my assistant walked by and casually mentioned that Timmy had been bothering the other employees in the waiting area, demanding they play with him or calling them losers for being too adult. I felt a terrible conflict churning in my stomach. Jay was perfect for the role, though that boy was an absolute nightmare, and I was torn between professionalism and the worry of what would happen if I brought on an employee with such an obnoxious child. I didn't have time for disrupted sessions or thrown tantrums. The company was already on shaky ground, and I was the one responsible for keeping it afloat. So as Jay returned to my office, I maneuvered for an excuse and let my hesitation spill out in a vague discomfort, the emotional turmoil roiling within me as I fabricated a lie about needing someone with more experience. Jay's face fell. He looked crestfallen, and for a fleeting moment, I wished I could take it all back, but Timmy was watching me with an unsettling grin, as if he knew I had made the right choice, as if there was no chance in hell I'd be getting rid of him anytime soon. I forced myself to shake off the guilt and reminded myself that I had made the best decision for the company, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that justice was waiting just outside my office door. Reservations mingled with curiosity as days turned into weeks following that interview. I watched the other potential hires flourish or flounder, and every time Jay's name popped up on my screen, his applications to other companies, His social media updates showcasing just how incredible he was. I bit my lip, torn between relief and creepy fascination. But the more I read, the more I felt something was off about Timmy. Posts about them together, Jay and that brat, showed Timmy looking more sinister than before. Even his questions seemed designed to push buttons, as if he reveled in torturing adults. I tried not to think too much of it, until one fateful evening when I received a notification that sent ice prickling down my spine. Jay posted a video to his feed titled "What My Son Can Do." I watched it with bated breath, my heart racing, the warm glow of my screen illuminating my face as I saw Timmy. Only, he was different, older, wearing a hoodie, and surrounded by other kids who looked just like him, eyes dark and expressive, as they chanted hypnotically. The camera zoomed in on Timmy, excitement glistening in his eyes as he held the same robot from before, but it blinked ominously, mechanical limbs twisting in an unnatural dance. I couldn't tear my eyes away in horror. Each flash of their smug, taunting smiles felt like daggers piercing my gut. The chant echoed through my ears, and the connection struck me like lightning. It can find you. It can always find you. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Timmy stared at me in that office, the crushing weight of his gaze. I thought it was merely a child's interest, but I realized it was so much more, a predator's gaze. That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with my thoughts. What kind of kid mates with robots? What kind of father encourages that? All I could think of was how I had wanted to protect my company, my employees, and, most importantly, myself from that smug little devil. The chance that I could have hit Jay, a talented employee, and been rid of that wretched kid gnawed at the edges of my mind like a relentless itch. Days later, I stumbled across a chilling thread buried in a forum. Some people were talking about mysterious disappearances linked to robotic toys, and it all seemed like coincidental chatter until I read the last post. They know where you are. They always know. It was signed simply as a parent. And, suddenly, all the puzzle pieces clicked. Jay had been the common factor in all these incidents. I recalled that night, shadows creeping along my walls, hearing strange whirring outside my window, and then silence fell over my home like a thick blanket. I stepped outside, heart racing, locking eyes with the hulking silhouette of a robot shaped like Timmy's toy in the distance. My breaths grew shallow. I read the words of the parent over and over again until their essence sank into my soul. That's when I made the decision to confront Jay, to warn him about the dark world his son was threading them into. But when I finally called him, his voice was hollow, coated with an unsettling calm, almost as if there was a barrier between us, a stretch of dread woven into every syllable. "Timmy has a gift," he said, his tone eerily cheerful. "You should be proud of him. He's smarter than any of us." I hung up, fingers trembling in disbelief, some part of me knowing that I had just brushed my fingers against something incredibly sinister. Days turned into a long spiral of paranoia. I searched for every connection I could within that forum and watched Timmy's posts evolve into grotesque spectacles. The videos morphed into something else altogether, a twisted extravaganza with Timmy at the center, surrounded by wheeled creations. I was ensnared, bewitched, doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by denying Jay the position. One afternoon, my assistant rushed in, eyes wide and distraught. "Have you seen the news?" I had barely sat down when the report blared through the air, headlines about kids across the city going missing, linked to a mysterious boy who congregated others in their homes, dressed in hoodies like ghouls addressing the lost in a diluted ceremony. My heart raced as she looked at me, asking if I knew anything about Timmy. I felt the weight of my decision crash down like a tidal wave, and that night, I laid blankets across my windowsills as I heard the distant whirring, that unmistakable sound that reminded me of childhood nightmares. I watched the street under a cautious gaze, terrified of that twisted robot apparition, hoping I had done enough to protect my family from whatever had emerged. But then, caught within my paranoia, I felt my phone buzz, and a new notification glimmered in the dark, a message from Jay that read, "Timmy wants to meet you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, I felt impotent. In the pool of fluorescent light, I clasped the sheets around me, heart pounding so viciously that I could hardly breathe, worried that in saying no to a father's ambition I had awakened something insatiable, an evil creature born in the guise of a child everyone ignored, leading into the night with a lost grin and the glint of metal. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the last thing I remember before the dream took me was the primal instinct of terror wrapping around my throat, echoing a warning deep inside, "It can always find you." Just before I woke, shivering, as the sound of soft giggles danced through my open window, whispering the name of my darkest fears, the name of a boy whose father I had wronged, who, unbeknownst to me, was living a nightmare far darker than any choice I had made. I am that awful ex who everyone dreads, the kind of guy who leaves scorched earth in his wake, heartache trailing like a shadow. But I swear it wasn't always like this. I don't remember falling into the void, yet here I am, a cautionary tale for anyone who dares to fall in love with a monster disguised as a man. It started innocently enough, high school sweethearts with Sarah, perfectly imperfect, laughter shared over slushies in the summer sun, promising forever while the stars bore witness. But a crack formed when I first laid eyes on Amanda at that dreadful party. It wasn't my fault, really. She was just so much more alive than Sarah, filled with this infectious energy that spiraled around us, pulling me in like a moth to flame, and before I knew it, I was wrapped in a web of deceit, whispering sweet nothings to Amanda while maintaining the guise of loyal boyfriend to Sarah. I justified it. After all, Sarah had her charm, but Amanda made my heart race, like the adrenaline rush of a roller coaster, each kiss an exhilarating free fall. But the bliss was short-lived because I was an idiot, too enamored with myself and my double life. And it all came crashing down like a house of cards when Sarah found out, her eyes wide with betrayal, tears staining her cheeks, and I could almost hear my heart splintering, the sound echoing in the hollow silence I left behind. I tried to make it right, desperate to stitch together the frayed edges of a love I had discarded so carelessly, but Sarah wouldn't take me back, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was a monster. The world turned gray, and I retreated into my misery, convinced that love was an illusion destined to betray me, and I clung to Amanda, who was only too happy to embrace my shattered soul. We were a disaster, feeding off one another's chaos until the inevitable happened. She found someone, the knife twisting in my gut as I watched her laugh with him, the sparkle in her eyes that once belonged to me now shining so brightly for another. That's when the darkness seeped in, bringing shadows that whispered lies to me every night, drowning me in thoughts that unraveled the frayed threads of my sanity. This is when I became the very person I had dreaded. I plotted and schemed, convinced that my love was a commodity I could win back, a twisted game of emotional chess where I would emerge victorious. I started showing up where I knew Amanda would be, slipping into her life like a ghost, haunting her at coffee shops and crowded bars, never missing a chance to remind her of our past, dredging up memories like a fisherman pulling up wreckage from the river. At first, she seemed flattered, but as my obsession grew, her smiles faltered, replaced by awkward glances and whispered conversations with friends who wore the same worried expressions. Sensing I was losing her, a pitiful rage ignited within, pushing me to the darkest corners of my mind, where sanity fought for space against my reckless need to possess her once more. I crafted elaborate schemes, sending her flowers with taunting notes that hinted at what we had shared, crafting social media posts designed to make her second-guess her choices until it all spiraled out of control. And one night, the small voice of rationality was overrun by desperation when I smashed the glass of a bar to anonymous cheers, shouting Amanda's name as if conjuring demons. Little did I know, I summoned my own. The aftermath was like waking from a nightmare, bloodied knuckles and a pile of regrets at my feet, yet she still wasn't mine. The further I fell into this abyss, the more insane I became, each obsession wrapped tighter around my mind, warping it until I lost track of time and reality. And then came the messages that told me I had crossed a line, foreboding reminders from her friends who threatened police intervention if I didn't back off. But I laughed like a madman, believing that love was worth any price. I thought I could turn the tides, but instead, I only pushed her further away until, one stormy night, I found myself standing outside her new apartment, heart racing and drenched in rain, imagining a world where I could convince her to want me again, pounding on her door like desperation itself until it swung open, and I saw the horror on her face as she took in the sight of me. That's when I truly broke. I let loose the dark thoughts that had been creeping, whispering in shadows. I promised her I would ruin anyone in my way and laughed madly, but the look on her face shifted from fear to pity, and that's when I felt it, like a shadow creeping up my spine. Something in the depths of me snapped, and I dragged my trembling fingers through my hair, realizing I was no longer the charming idiot she had fallen for but a wounded beast. Nobody dreads someone like that. My heart raced as I choked out apologies, begging her to see what we had shared, to acknowledge the remnants of love still tangled in the roots of our past. But she called me sick, wrapped in the surety of her discomfort, and I could feel everything recoiling in my gut. Without realizing it, I was losing my grip again, spiraling down into an even darker pit. I felt my world squeezing tight, the place that once felt secure tearing apart at the seams, and in that moment, enveloped by her quiet dismissal, I recognized a familiar shadow creeping in. I heard a voice, flat and void of emotion, whispering sharp and cold like a blade pressed to the throat. What do you have left to you? I couldn't breathe. I felt consumed, and as I stumbled back, The world around me blurred until Amanda slammed the door in my face, shattering the last fragments of my sanity. Outside her apartment, I cried into the rain, but no tears came. Instead, I was left with that hollow ache, an echoing emptiness found only in empty bottles and late-night rantings, wondering how I would ever escape this hell I had made for myself, a twisted ex that everyone would dread. And somewhere, deep down, beyond the wreckage, I realized the darkness wasn't just a cloak I wore, it had become me, and I was now forever bound to it, a prisoner of my own creation, a hurt that can't heal, a curse cast and returned. That's the awful truth, you see. I am that awful ex who everyone dreads, forever haunted by the choices I made, living in the dread of knowing that even love can turn into a haunting nightmare.